I'm Richard Reeves. I'm a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, and I'm going to be talking this morning about a particular aspect of inequality. It's an aspect of inequality whereby it's not the result of trends that are outside of our control or trends which are the result of distant forces, but they're the result of intentional actions by those in positions of power to maintain their position at the expense of others, to opportunity hoard, and to become effectively the people who are hoarding the American dream as a result of specific intentional policy. So here I'm going to be ending here, but rather than inequality as the result of these kind of antiseptic, dispassionate forces that can be solved with tax and transfers, they're deeply embedded in the political economy of a society. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the backdrop to this and the kind of journey. But I obviously have to start with an apology, because I'm going to talk about inequality and class in America with this accent. So I'll get my defenses in early. First of all, where I come from, we know a lot about class and how class systems work. And I have come to the conclusion in my 5 years since moving here that the American class system operates more ruthlessly and more effectively than the British class system I attempted to escape when I moved here. As the US is a more class-bound society than the UK is, it is merely camouflaged by a veneer of classlessness and a myth of meritocracy. So that's part of my defense. And the second is that I actually am now a US citizen. I became a US citizen in 2016, so now I can speak to both of my nations. In fact, I became a citizen on the very last day in my state. I live in Maryland, just outside DC, where you had to register to vote in order to vote in the presidential election. It was the very last day, and I was in the very last ceremony, citizenship ceremony of that day. So I was among the last 53 people from 47 countries to become citizens on that day, and every single one of us marched over to the Women's League of Voters and registered to vote in the presidential election, because I was determined to do that. I also, because I've retained my UK citizenship, was able to vote by ballot, by mail-in, I should say, in the Brexit referendum back in the UK. So it was a banner year for me, politically speaking. Not partisan. A French friend actually texted me and said, "Don't take French citizenship." And I didn't, and Macron won. That might not be causal. We'll get into that. We'll get into causality. And so actually part of my work has been a bit of a reflection on the comparisons between inequality in the UK and the US. My particular focus for a long time has been around intergenerational mobility, social mobility, and the extent to which inequality perpetuates itself across generations. It's the inheritance of inequality rather than the existence of inequality that has motivated most of my work. That was true in the UK government. I was in the coalition government as a senior political advisor to the Deputy Prime Minister on the Liberal Democrat side of the coalition and led the creation of our social mobility strategy. Now at Brookings, my work has been around mobility, inequality, and now increasingly what's happening to the middle class. So I'm going to get into that. I don't know who any of you are, of course. So I just, without taking too much of your time to do this, it's just really helpful for me to kind of situate you in this kind of debate where you're coming from. So I hope you've had a chance to at least read a little bit of Dream Hoarders. There was a bit on the reading list, like one chapter or something, and some background, I think one article that sort of summarized it. So what I need to know from each of you, I'm just going to go around. I need to know your name. I need to know what you're currently studying and at what level, and whether or not you think, based on what you know already, that you might be a dream hoarder or the product of dream hoarding. You don't have to answer that one, but it'd be kind of fun to know at this point before we go kind of lecture where we are. So what I'm going to do is start there, go along that row, and then back along there, and I'm going to make notes of your name so that as we get into sort of hopefully we'll get into some cut and thrust debate, I'll know who's arguing with me. Yes, you.
I'm Akshay.
Can you say your name again a bit louder?
Akshay.
Akshay.
Yeah.
Yep.
I am doing a master's at Paris School of Public Policy here in Chicago.
Okay. MPP. And you're a dream hoarder?
I come from India, and I think I am a dream hoarder.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Salar.
Salar?
Solar.
Salar. Yeah, thank you.
I'm from Baltimore. I'm studying health policy, master's student.
Okay.
And I agree with him. I kind of grew up in the U.S., but I'm originally from Iran.
Okay. All right, thank you. Yes.
Hi, I'm Nelson. I'm an RA at the Inter-American Development Bank, and I'm applying to an econ PhD this year.
Okay.
I come from Peru. So I guess
I can't define dream hoarding in Peru and Iran, and that's the trouble. It's getting harder. Let's hope we get some US people who are willing to throw themselves under the bus. Yes.
Hi, I'm Daniel. I'm from Germany, and I study economics there at the master's level.
Econ and masters. Okay, good. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Serena. I'm from Canada. I'm currently working at a public policy think tank on Canada-Asia relations, and I am the product of dream hoarding.
Product of dream hoarding. Great. Thank you.
I'm Hannah. I'm currently a public health research coordinator, and I think I'm probably the product of dream hoarding.
Probably a product, yeah. Okay,
My name is Melanie. I'm a recent Master's of Public Administration graduate from the University of Washington. Currently work at a child welfare nonprofit. And I don't think that I'm the product of dream hoarding, but I think that I have actually moved social classes and I'm at a point where I may become a dream hoarder.
It's tempting, isn't it?
This is Anuradha. I'm from India and I'm pursuing PhD. And my topic is saying this combination of finance and economics, intergenerational mobility plus leverage, inequality. And I think I'm a dream hoarder.
Okay, good. This is good. This is good. Let's just get it all out. Yes.
My name is Megan Stahl, and I currently work at an organization focusing on where we can use resources, money, and talent to help youth most left behind in Chicago's more fragile communities. And I think I'm probably a dream hoarder, but the jury's still out.
Okay. We'll do it again at the end. We'll figure out whether. Yeah.
I'm Sarah Collier. I'm a doctoral student in human development and social policy at Northwestern, and I think I'm not the product of, but a dream hoarder.
Good. Thank you.
I'm Cora Wicker. I'm also a PhD.
Sorry, say your name again a bit louder.
CRA.
Mm-hmm.
I'm also a PhD student in human development and social policy at Northwestern. And I think I'm somewhat a product of it, and definitely moving into PhD.
Developing the resources in order to be able to do it. Yeah. Okay. And behind you.
Hi, I'm Kia.
Kia? Yeah.
I'm a master's student from Paris. I think I'm a dream hoarder.
All right. We'll find out.
Hi, I'm Jing. I work at the China Development Research Foundation.
Say your first name again a bit louder.
My name is Jing. I work at the China Development Research Foundation.
Okay,
It's
great.
a non-profit nationwide foundation. We run lots of poverty alleviation programs in the China's rural areas.
Thank you.
I'm not sure if I'm a dream hoarder or not. I hope I can find out at the end of this class.
There is a little video game you can do online, actually. We might do that. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Charlene. I'm pursuing my master's in econ at Claremont Graduate University, and I think I'm a dream hoarder. Not sure.
Okay. Thank you.
I'm Jing Cho. I'm from China Development Research Foundation too, and I work on some child development projects.
Can you say your first name again for me?
Jing Cho, Jingqi.
Tin Shaw.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah.
I'm Michelle. I'm from the University of Zurich, and I'm doing currently my econ master there. And I'm not quite sure if I'm dream hoarder. It might be.
No. Okay. Good.
I'm Rosario. I'm from the Central Bank of Chile. I think I might be the product of and I hope to be one.
Rosario.
Yeah.
Okay. Good. Yes.
Hi, my name is Diego Guerrero from San Carlos State University. I'm originally from Venezuela.
Oh.
I don't think I'm a dream hoarder. You could say I'm trying to become one.
Yeah, well, I'm a failed dream hoarder. That's why I wrote the book. It's sort of a cry of anger and pain. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Abhijit. I work at Harvard Business School as a researcher. I'm not very sure.
Did you say Abuji?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Alex. I'm from Boston originally. I'm a Master of Public Policy student. I'm from upper middle class, so I put myself in that category.
Yeah.
My name is Christian. I'm a master's student in economic development at the University of Glasgow.
Oh, good.
I'm originally from Mexico, and I don't think that I'm.
You don't think you are? Say Christian or Christian?
Christian.
Christian or Christian?
Christian.
Christian. Okay. Great. Thank you. You're a student.
Hi, I'm Imrul. I finished my master's.
Say your name again really loud. It's actually quite hard to hear from you. Yep.
Imrul.
Imrun. Yep.
I finished my master's from here, and I think I'll be a dream holder.
You're aspiring to it. Yes. Okay. Any other students?
My name is Sunny C. Chang Jonas. I'm an assistant principal and working on my PhD in bilingual education. I'm trying to understand how principals are using their financial budgets and their other resources to actually help build community and do social emotional wellness in school.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Lina. I'm from Colombia. My undergrad was in accounting, and now I'm reading for studying a master in inequalities. And I don't know if I am dreaming of there.
All right, good. Did you say Nina or Nina?
Lina.
Lina.
With an L.
With an L. Okay, thank you.
L-I-N.
Yeah, good. Thank you. Thank you. What a great international. I'm not sure I've ever spoken to such an international crowd. So, in advance, I'll say that the data I'm using here is US, but many of the trends will be similar in other countries. So, I'm going to get into some data. I have a lot of charts coming, but you knew you were going to get that when you signed up for this course. There are, however, no equations. I am not an economist. I work in economic studies, but my background is in political philosophy and policy, and I've basically been making it up as I go along. So don't worry, no equations, because they make my eyes glaze over. I have other colleagues who don't understand what those are telling me. So there'll be lots of charts, but there will be no equations, right? That's my promise to you. I will briefly mention the IGE, which I know Stephen mentioned to you around elasticity, but that will be very brief and you'll barely feel it. And we'll move on very quickly. But I'm going to start with a story. I'm going to have a motivation story before we get into the data. I'm going to start with... All right, so we're going to start with a story about this gentleman. Now, you're a young crowd, and many of you from overseas, so just in case, this is Barack Obama, 44th President of the United States. Doesn't it feel like a long time ago? Yes. Really? It's like there's like human years, dog years, Trump years. You know what I mean? It's like time. It's like moving through treacle. I can't believe it. It feels like a generation ago that Obama was in the White House. But anyway, I'm going to start a story about him. And those of you who read it will kind of know where I'm going with this now, so I can go through it quickly. But I tell the story in the opening of the book. So have you read chapter 1 of the book? Is that what you've read, or the introduction? Do I tell this story? Have you read the story about Obama and what happened to him? He's flying on Air Force One across the Arabian Sea. Actually on his way from India to Saudi Arabia, and traveling with him is this woman, Nancy Pelosi. Nancy Pelosi gets a phone call. Nancy Pelosi gets a phone call from this man, Chris Van Hollen. Chris Van Hollen, then congressman, my congressman in Maryland, now the junior senator for Maryland. And he calls Nancy and he says, we have a problem with this tax proposal from the president. You're going to go and talk to him? She says, well, I'm on Air Force One. I'll just wander down the corridor, go and see him. So he's sitting in his office. There's a knock at the door. Hi, come in. Who is it? It's Nancy. I wasn't there, so I'm basing this on... This is like what they say in Hollywood, like based on true events. Hey, come in. Hey, it's Nancy. What do you want? Hey, what's up? What's the problem? Well, we've got to kill this idea, this tax thing. It's killing me. I've spoken to Chris. Emails are filling up. You've just got to reverse course on this. He says, all right, I will consult with my senior advisors. Having consulted my senior advisors, I will deal with it. He calls the White House and says, hello, White House, it's the president, kill the idea. Again, I wasn't there, not sure what he actually said, but the result was, this is not a video, I'm not going to play it, was that the very next day, the idea was abandoned. The idea was, for those who've done the reading, to reform something called 529 college savings accounts. An idea first proposed in Bill Clinton's presidency by the Republicans. Bill Clinton vetoed it. Only after Clinton lost and Bush came in were the Republicans able to get it through. 529 accounts are established by states in the US to encourage savings towards college education, and they are free of capital gains tax at the point of taking them out. They are mostly immune from the gift tax rules. You can super fund them. In fact, Obama himself did put $250,000 or something like that into his kids' 529 accounts. Normally you'd get hit by gift taxes, but you can avoid that if they go into a 529. And most states also offer you an income tax deduction against your state income tax on your 529 account. So where I live in Maryland, my wife and I are allowed to say, we have 2 kids who are of school age, we're allowed to save $10,000 a year into their 529 accounts, $2,500 per adult per child, and set that against Maryland income tax. Maryland income tax, we're top rate taxpayers, is 6.75. That saves us $675 a year. Not bad return for just saving $10,000 to do something you were going to do anyway, right? Now, the problem with it is that it's hugely regressive. So these data are pretty old now, but we don't have the more recent data yet, and it doesn't matter how you cut the data. This shows you 2 things. One, you're seeing the percentage of households who have 529 accounts by where they are in the income distribution. I'm using quartiles now because that's how they produce the data. Later I'm going to use quintiles. And I apologize in advance because some people use quartiles, some people use quintiles. It's a nightmare. If we could just agree, there needs to be an international convention on the quartile-quintile decision. We could all finally decide which it's going to be. Anyway, this is quartiles from the poorest to the richest. Quartiles. And so the dark blue line is the percentage of households, this is all households with and without children, who have a 529 account. And then the other bar is, of those who have a 529 account, what's the average balance in that 529 account? In fact, in the survey that this had to be based on, I think this is like one person in the survey with $300 in a 529 account. Now, this makes perfect rational sense because the exemption from capital gains tax is only useful if you think if there's any chance you're going to be subject to capital gains tax. And until your household income reaches around, who's the tax expert here? 90,000 a year, whatever it is, shared income, something like that, right? It has to be reasonably high for you to be subject to capital gains tax anyway. If you're not going to be subject to it, you don't benefit from the tax break. You might benefit from some of the state tax deductions, but again, if you're paying it at a relatively low rate, it's relatively low return. And of course, people who don't have very much money find it hard to save money. You know, it's much easier to save money if you have money. As I said, I'm not an economist, I'm pretty sure that's true. And so you get this distributional effect. And so what Obama and his people said, and actually one of my close colleagues, Adam Looney, was basically the architect of this policy, would say this is just insane. And all the evidence from people like Susan Dynarski and others is it doesn't affect savings behavior. We just switch it over into the more tax-advantaged plan. It doesn't affect college going. It doesn't impact at all. It's essentially, there's no evidence for policy impact, and it's pretty expensive. I think we're up to a couple of billion a year and rising for 529s. So Obama said, let's get rid of it and basically put the money into the American Opportunity Tax Credit, which is significantly more progressive because it's a credit rather than a break. And it wouldn't, whilst it would not have been exactly socialism, it would nonetheless have helped people in the middle a lot more than the 529 account. So let's just get rid of it. Classic example of just sensible policy making. But they hadn't prepared the ground politically, and the sky fell in. Chris Van Hollen, Nancy Pelosi. The idea wasn't killed by Republicans. They knew they were going to be against it. It was killed by liberal Democrats. Even though the 529 element in the tax code is perhaps, and I can't prove this definitively, the most regressive element in the US tax code. And that's quite a claim. Even though it couldn't go, because once it was in place, we had it. And I'm not going to get too much into this because I know the lecture tomorrow is going to talk about tax policy and kind of inequality, and I'm joining you for that, if you don't mind. I'll sit in for that because I'm really excited about that. But what this does, I've just taken the bottom 40% of the distribution, middle 40, top 20. Here I'm using household income to make the distinction across the distribution. And this just shows you the value of, in billions of dollars, of these different kind of tax breaks. And don't forget, there's only half as many people in this group as there are in these groups. And so what you're seeing is kind of significant value. The only ones that really help people in the bottom and middle are tax credits. So basically, we're talking about the earned income tax credit there, etc. But most of the others on capital gains, state and local taxes, the SALT deductions, which the new tax bill at least limits, and they're facing a lawsuit, as you'll know, from some of the blue states on that. Mortgage interest deduction, etc. Right? So I won't labor the point because you're going to get in tomorrow. But these upside-down tax subsidies are a huge problem, of which 529 is just a great symbolic example. This is the median income in the areas broadly represented, not exactly coterminous with the congressional districts, but similar. This is in 2015 dollars for the San Francisco County, that's Pelosi, Montgomery County, where I live, that's Van Hollen against the national average. This is the median. So these are affluent areas. They're pretty blue. They're pretty liberal. You know, they're absolutely rock-solid Democrat areas and pretty liberal, very socially liberal. They're the kind of neighborhoods where you'll see right now there's lots of signs in the yards. You know, resist and Black Lives Matter, etc. All welcome here. You know, there's kind of those sort of you know, acts, expressive acts that people are engaged in. Those sorts of neighborhoods, right? You know what I'm talking about. Those kind of, but they're the neighborhoods that kill 529. Because the emails blew up, because you know what, it's our money. And so the sense of entitlement was what really grasped me. And I read this from Paul Waldman in the Washington Post, where he said this proposal, the 529 proposal, was targeted at the single most dangerous constituency to anger, the upper middle class. Wealthy enough to have influence and numerous enough to be a significant voting bloc. So there's a lot of votes from the top 20% too. And in most of what follows in my work, I make a distinction between the top 20% of the income distribution, which now I think is about household income of more than 140,000 a year. The median is about 200,000 a year. That kind of groups, that's the group we're talking about. And I think that's the group that are kind of breaking away from the rest of US society in a way that's profoundly dangerous. Not just the 1%, which I'll get onto. So this is the motivation for writing a book, Dream Hoarders, in which I kind of talk about the way in which those who have money and power are essentially rigging the system in their favor. The tax system is but one example. And in the end, I don't focus very much on the tax system in the book, not least because that's been well covered by other scholars, including Bill Gale, my scholar at Brookings, who has a book coming out with the brilliant title, Fiscal Therapy. I mean, that's brilliant. And the book is good, and it talks a lot about the inequalities in the tax system. So that's the story that got me down this path. And here's what I'm going to do today. Here's the structure of my time with you today. I'm going to argue, first of all, that the upper middle class, defined as this top 20%, are separating from the majority, not only economically, but on lots of other dimensions too, socially, spatially, maritally, educationally, occupationally. Right, this is a multi-dimensional class fracture. I'm then going to argue that it's not just a point in time, but it's enduring across generations, that we're seeing this inheritance of inequality, especially at the top. I'm going to talk about 4 of the kind of big empirical things that we can say that seem to be lying behind this inheritance of inequality, this stickiness, both at the bottom and the top, which I kind of summarize as FERG, family, education, race, and geography. I'm going to go through those. And then I'm going to talk about, so this, I hope that I'll be able to cover first 3 before we have a break, and then come back to these ideas of market meritocracy and opportunity hoarding, which is what I think is driving, what lies behind. So I'm going to describe the trends. I'm going to describe what's happening as empirically and as objectively as I can, and then I'm going to say what lies behind it. And these are 2 main mechanisms: the idea of meritocracy in a market, opportunity hoarding, cheating, if you prefer, and then this fundamental issue that people who are rich have convinced themselves that they're not, and that is a fundamental political problem to solving anything around inequality. That's the structure I'm going to go through. Any questions at this point? Okay, so please raise your hand if you don't understand something or don't agree with something or whatever. Also, if I'm covering ground that has been covered by others already, just shout, boring, or we know that already, or just something. I mean, try not to shout boring. Don't shout boring just because it is boring, because some of it is going to be boring. But what I mean by that is like repetitive. Maybe that's better, not boring. Maybe heard it before, something like that, just because I don't know, okay? So I'm relying on you. Please don't sit there rolling your eyes saying, really? We know this, because I don't know. So tell me. First of all, the upper middle class is separating from the majority. I'm going to go through this real quick because I think a lot of you will know this literature well by the sounds of your work. You can obviously find it. To say that there are a lot of books and papers on inequality would be an understatement. Telling different stories, to be sure. So I'm just going to tell you my story very quickly. So I'm going to start with the we are the 1% story. Who's heard the phrase, we are the 99%? Right. Who's heard of Occupy Wall Street? Right, etc. So that became the kind of frame through which inequality was discussed. And the work of Thomas Piketty and others has really kind of reinforced this kind of sense that it's the kind of 1%. It is certainly true, but I don't think it's the whole truth, that it's just the 1%. And I actually have come to believe that the we are the 99% framing is unhelpful, because it allows too many people who are in the 90s, say, to convince themselves that it's them. I was struck by some findings which I'll come on to in a moment about who attended the May Day demonstrations in New York, which I may have mentioned in here. So here I'm talking up to 2011, but the story is pretty much the same. You see a bigger dip after the recession. And here's what I'm doing in this chart. I'm taking the average income of these different groups, the bottom 40%, so that's bottom 2/5 of the distribution, the next 2/5 of the distribution, the 19% above them, and the 1%. Okay? What's happening to, so this is kind of just the income, so you're seeing average real income, it's household size, for the household kind of over time, right? I mean, you could argue the details, but every time you do it, you're going to get a chart that looks a little bit like this, regardless of how you kind of pull it out, right? So this is a sort of we are the 99% chart. This is the kind of chart that makes me want to pitch a tent in the middle of Wall Street and start protesting. Because I'm in this group. I'm in the 80th to 99. I'm not in the top 1%. But I am in this 19 kind of percent, right? So I see a chart like this. I'm like, look, we're all in it together. Look, the bottom 99% are being left behind. Everything on this chart is true. There are nuances about how you're measuring what's happening to the 1%, capital income, etc. But nonetheless, basically true. But as you will know by now, economists, social scientists do their dirty work in various places. We do them in our footnotes. Ooh, first of all, that's pre-tax. Pre or post, right? You know that. Don't even need to label that point. Pre or post tax. Sometimes, so we do our dirty work in our footnotes. We do our dirty work in our adjustments for household size. Did you adjust for household size, yes or no? I can change lots of headline results by adjusting for household size or not. Which deflator did you use? Which measure of inflation did you use? That makes a pretty big difference. What did you do with the zeros? What, in your calculation, did you do with the people whose household incomes was measured as 0? That can make a significant difference. Some people say, we excluded the zeros for the purposes of this. Now, of course, you're going to ask me, what did you do? So always ask people, what did you do with the zeros? Right? If you want to flummox someone who's presenting work done by their research assistant, and it's an income distribution kind of thing, right? And ask them, interesting, what did you do with the zeros? The people who had household incomes of 0. If they don't know the answer, you know that RA did the work. And I can't remember whether it's just zeros on here because my RA did this for me. But for purposes of this exercise, that doesn't matter. I'm just making that these are the kind of questions. But of course, the other place you do your dirty work is in the left-hand axis. First of all, you can be really, really naughty and start your left-hand axis at something other than 0. Sometimes you get charts where, so within the same paper, they're starting the left-hand axis at different points, at different stages of the paper. So sometimes it starts at 30 kind of value. Always look at where they start the left-hand axis, right? It's the dirtiest and cheapest trick in the book. Sometimes it's justified, but it's got to be done hands above the table, and it's got to be done consistently. I've done it from 0, but because I've got the 1% in there, I've had to go up to 2 million. That has the inevitable effect of stretching up the chart and squashing down everything else. So look at us, just bumping along with everybody else. I'm just an ordinary middle-class American. So tell you what we'll do. Let's take out the top 1% altogether. This chart now, they do not appear in that. Yes? Ashay, yeah.
Even now, the bottom part of the distribution would not have EITC incorporated.
Quite right.
So that would be a wrong trend, perhaps.
Right. So what I'm showing is, I'm showing market trends. I'm showing market inequality. I'm showing pre-tax. I'm showing what's happening in the market. You're quite right. This is not the amount of money they actually end up with. And that's intentional for my purposes because I want to see what's happening in the market. I want to see, are you earning more? What's your human capital, etc. But bang on, exactly right. Show you, and I'm sure you're going to see that, but different charts which include post-tax and transfer. Plus, if you really get into it, what do you do about healthcare? Right? My colleague Gary Burtless has just written about this in reaction to the claims from the Trump administration that the war on poverty is over. And that debate is absolutely fascinating to me because it is quite true that for different reasons, historically, both the left and the right have understated the value of transfers to people at the bottom of the distribution. And in the US, it's particularly difficult to measure the value of healthcare. Right? Are you less poor because you've got government-provided healthcare? Should that count? And no one really has a good answer to that. And so some of the best answer I've come up with is estimate the value, estimate the kind of economic value of healthcare, and give them half of that. And just add half of the value of that to their income. I mean, the best just because no one's come up with anything better, so why not just kind of do half? So you're right, but if you do that, incomes come up and up and up, and what you'll see is that actually there's been significant success in the sense of transferring to people who are poor. So thank you for that. Good clarification. This is market income. It doesn't include anything. This is what's happening to us before the government gets involved and does significant redistribution. It's almost like what you start with, right? It's a starting position. So the bottom 40 is still bouncing along. The next 40, doing a little bit better, but pretty decent. And now you've got us. The 19%, right? So that's people, as I said, who in current terms are above household incomes, about 140, median 200, that kind of number. Professionals, by and large, is at least 1 4-year degree, but I'll get onto that. And what you can see is, it's over the same time period, they're pulling away. Now, I grant you, it's not as exciting a chart. No one has had marches off the back of that, but that says a whole hell of a lot more people. You're talking about 19% of the distribution rather than everybody else. But nonetheless, it is my view, based on all the work that's been done on inequality, is that whilst it is clear that there's this 1% story, there is also a 15 to 20% story. Just thinking about income, and wealth, just talking about money. As I say, it's kind of less dramatic, but more important. I would argue more important, because there's more people, and because these people can then use this position to alter housing markets, education markets, healthcare markets, etc. They have market power well above and beyond you would get from just the kind of 1%. So you're kind of seeing this gap, and I think that's kind of part of the story of what's happening in the US. But it's not just money. We're also seeing, this is wage gap now. So we can do this relatively quickly. This is an EPI report, and it's done pretty solidly. Quite like what they've done with it. And what they've just done here, this is for men. You get a similar pattern for women, although the lines will go up for women. Women's wages across the board have increased. What you're seeing here is over the same time period I just showed you, 70s up to 2010, is what's the difference between the 50-10 gap and the 90-10 gap in terms of male wages. So in other words, look at 90th percentile, 10th percentile, middle percent. So that's just a way to kind of see, okay, so you see this kind of big gap growing between the top, the 90th percentile of the wage distribution for men, and the bottom, that's the blue line, massively rising wage inequality for men over that period. Again, not breaking news. What the 50-10 does is say, okay, well, how much of that is what's happening at the bottom? And the 50-10 gap is basically flat. And so we haven't seen, it's not the middle of the wage distribution pulling away from the bottom, it's the top of the wage distribution pulling away from everybody else. Okay, so it's this top-heavy inequality that you're seeing again in the kind of wages. Not just wages, it's where we live. This is Sean Reardon's work with Kendra Bischoff out of Stanford. And what this does is shows you what's happened over time, it's from 1970 to 2010, to the kinds of areas that people live in. And the way they calculate the kind of area you live in is by comparing the median income in a neighborhood with the median income, with the national median income. So they're seeing how much separation is there from that, and then seeing what proportion of people live in affluent areas, etc. And what you're just seeing over time is something we kind of probably knew, but which Reardon and Bischoff can kind of show, which is that there is growing income segregation in space. So in other words, there's been an increase in the number of people living in predominantly low-income neighborhoods. There's also been an increase in the number of people living in predominantly high-income neighborhoods. So we're seeing that the income inequality that you see in other measures is now clearly spatially happening too. So alongside a slight reduction in racial segregation in the US, it's down. It's a modest trend line down from what I never tire of reminding people is an extraordinarily high starting place for obvious reasons, and remains internationally incredibly high. The US remains highly racially segregated. Nonetheless, it is at least going down. Income segregation is going up. So our neighborhoods are becoming somewhat more racially diverse, although we should note that a big part of that is because of the significant rise in the number of Hispanics in the population. The black-white segregation has not changed all that much. Just the neighborhoods have become more mixed because there's a lot more Hispanics in the population, so more of the neighbors. So you've got slightly more racially mixed, but less income mix. So to put it really bluntly and crudely, I live in an affluent area. My neighbor is somewhat more likely to be African American or Hispanic than in the past, but she or he are less likely to be working class. Right? So as it happens, I do have a black neighbor, and she's a lawyer. Okay? And that's a kind of just a kind of really sort of anecdotal way to kind of drive the point home. I might have a black neighbor who's a lawyer. I'm not going to have a neighbor of any description who is a plumber unless they're Joe the plumber from the last election. It was worth a fortune. Actually, plumbers do pretty well. That's a bad example. A gardener, whatever. So income segregation, so we've seen it in space. Then we see it in other dimensions too, which I'm going to cover as we move into the next section. Okay, so I hope to persuade you at least that there's been this separation and it's not restricted to the top 1%, and that it's actually visible in housing and income and wealth. Okay, questions? Yes?
What do you think of consumption inequality?
Say that again?
What do you think of consumption inequality?
What do I think of consumption inequality?
Do you think it's a better way of looking at the problem, or do you think you still want to stick with the problem?
I think we should do both, frankly. I actually think that it's very useful to see what people are actually spending. It's sometimes harder to measure. Right? It's just more difficult to track. Income, if you've got decent surveys supported by administrative data, hopefully, or administrative data supported by surveys if you prefer, I feel pretty good that you can get close to an accurate figure for most people around income. It gets harder at the very bottom and the top, whereas consumption is just necessarily harder to track. You're almost certainly relying on reports, self-reports and surveys, and so it's just more volatile. That said, I think the evidence that from Bruce Meyer and others that if you look at how much people are spending versus how much their income is, there's an issue because people are somehow spending a whole heck of a lot more than they're getting. So how are they doing that? Are they borrowing? Probably not, because it's hard for those people to borrow. They're credit constrained. Are they working in the informal economy, getting money that we don't know about? Are they getting it from friends, etc.? We don't know. But I think the kind of basic point that you raise is important, which is that consumption should sit alongside income measures. I think it's quite hard to imagine shifting over completely for the measurement reasons that I identify, but it's a nice interruption to the simple story. And for example, I think it's been used to wholly disprove the $2 a day thesis in the US. I mean, Scott Winship and others, I think, have really shown quite clearly that work. I'm a huge fan of Kathy Edens and Luke Schaefer's. I think Kathy's working qualitative work in Baltimore and other places is world class. But the $2 a day stuff, it's basically not true, is my view. And part of the reason you can tell it because you look at consumption. You know, it's just people are just, how can you be living on $2 a day if you're spending $50 a day? Just, that can't be right over time. So good, very good question again. Okay, any other questions at this point before I move on to the next session? Or anybody worried about what I presented or thinking, nah, I don't buy that, or he's forgotten that? Okay, yes?
In my country, we did like a very similar approach to the slide you previously showed, and we found like the opposite. We found like the 90% is getting closer to the, we found like inequality is decreasing in the top. And what do you think there may be a difference between like developing countries and developed countries?
Well, I'm well outside my lane in terms of thinking about other countries. But first of all, I think paying attention to where the income distribution is changing shape is hugely important. That's why I don't really like Gini coefficient as a measure of inequality. I mean, there's other reasons I don't like it. Leave aside that he was a fascist, because that would be an ad hominem attack. Well, he was, but that's not my problem with it. It's because it's just giving you this, the Gini can change for so many different reasons. I'm more interested in where in the distribution, so I've done some work looking at so if you think about the income distribution as like an elastic band or a rubber band, whatever you call it, like where it's kind of stretching out, it's kind of stretching in. If you think about, it can stretch at different points. It could be being held still here and stretched over here at the top, or it could be being stretched here. And that has profound implications for the way you think about the kind of inequality you've got. It could well be, and this is just me, I'm speculating now, that as you're growing faster, that you would hope that more of the proceeds to growth are going to the people who just had so little to start with, that you almost they have to be catching up. That said, I think there are other countries that are kind of developing that are more like oligopolies where that's less true. So people are getting absolutely better off, but there might be some people at the top who are really pulling away. India, perhaps? Who knows the Indian data? Is that true of India?
Yeah, I mean, the top wages are really just going up. I mean, they're American level wages now.
Yeah, so a friend of mine's just written a book called The Billionaire Raj, which is about this kind of super and how many billionaires India's got now. And that massive tower Who's that guy that has that huge tower in Mumbai that's worth $1 billion? It's $1 billion house, yeah. So I think it's going to vary kind of across countries. So all I'd say is be attentive to that because it has huge implications for policy. Right? If the top 80% are basically moving up in lockstep and your Gini's going up or whatever because the bottom 20% are being left behind, then you're going to need very aggressive anti-poverty policies to help that 20%. If the bottom 80 are broadly moving in lockstep, partly as a result of the existing welfare systems, but the top 20 or the top 10 are kind of pulling away, if you think that's a problem, that leads to very different policies. So I think actually as we think about policy, understanding where in the distribution inequality is changing at different points in time is hugely important. So I can't answer your question, but it does bring me to think about policy. That's why I don't like these kind of just simple one figure measures of inequality, because they miss the distribution. I'm going to get onto that a little bit in terms of intergenerational mobility too, because that can sometimes happen in intergenerational mobility. For example, with the IGE, which I know Steve talked to you about yesterday. Okay, any other questions at this point? Challenges? Yes?
If most of the 529 holders are most of rich people, then Barack Obama took one reform measure and he got paid. So what's the way to come out of this rigidity at the top?
You're asking me for solutions now?
Yes.
Well, you have to wait. You have to come back after coffee.
If it's not through the policy measures, then what's the way?
Well, 529s, I forgot to say this earlier, not only did Obama reverse course, so the darn things are still with us, but in the tax bill, the Republicans expanded them. So 529 accounts, which were previously restricted for use for post-secondary education, are now available for private K-12 education. So I know a few copies of my book went to the White House. Do you know what my real fear is? They read the stuff on 529s and said, oh, 529s, what a great idea. Let's expand them. That's my real fear, is that I have had impact on policy in completely the wrong direction. So I can't list that on my Brookings impact thing. Hey, I really messed it up. But I definitely gave 529s a bit more salience, and this is my reward. And actually, that's a huge problem, because people who previously might not have bothered with a 529 account because capital gains is a long way off, and who knows, and it's like, even affluent people got around. Now, if your kid is in a private school, and you're in a state that gives you an income tax deduction, you're 529, you'd be insane not to have a 529 account if you just literally put it in and take it straight out again. And in New York, you only have to leave it in for 10 days anyway. You can just, it's called touch the toes provision in tax policy. Just literally put it in, take it straight out again. In Virginia, you don't even have to put it in the 529 account. You just have to tell them that you have to put it in the 529 account. You don't have to put it in. And so you don't have to put it in. But you'd open the account. You've got a kid in K-12. Let's say if you're in Maryland, you're paying $5,000, $10,000 a year more for a private school. You just put it in the 529 account in year one and use it for school fees in year two. Why would you not do that? Any financial advisor who isn't advising everybody who has kids in private school to open 529 accounts in all those states. And that, I've done some work with Nat Malka, some AI on that. That is going to hit the exchequers of some of these states, including Illinois and New York, that have relatively significant numbers of people in private schools and tax deductions on 529 accounts. If people suddenly start taking out more of the 529s and taking those deductions, it's going to hit their bottom line. Nat Malka's estimates it might just cost New York the order of billions of dollars of lost revenue as a result of 529 accounts. There was also a provision which got kicked out at the last moment. The Republicans wanted you to be able to open a 529 account for your unborn child, so that you could open a 529 account from the moment of conception rather than from the moment of birth. It would have been the first time that an unborn child had status in the US tax code. It was knocked out at the very last minute. And can you imagine the complexity of administering that? I would say that when it comes to figuring out when you conceived your child, the very last person you want talking to you about that is the IRS. So anyway, it didn't happen, thank God. Okay, any others? So I'm going to move on now. I know you've done some intergenerational stuff with Steve, and you all kind of know that, and so I can be relatively quick about this. And in this section, I'm now going to, as we move forward, I'm going to be relying quite heavily now on data from the Equality of Opportunity Project, which is led by Raj Chetty now back at Harvard. He went from Harvard to Stanford, has bounced back again, and has the IRS data linked to the Census Bureau data. So he did a recent report on race and gender and mobility, which he was able to do because he's got all the IRS data and all the census data merged. I'm now consulting with that project to try and take that data into particular communities. I'm working mostly in Charlotte, linking it to local administrative data to see what power you can have with that. But because it's just simply the best game in town now, because of the sheer weight of data that they have, I'm essentially relying mostly on their data. Here and there I'll use some others, and I'll try and indicate when I'm not. So this is Raj, so you'll see this a lot. You'll see this name kind of Chetty coming up. If I present data and I don't say who it is, presume it's Raj Chetty, or Nate Hendren, or John Friedman, or somebody. This is an intergenerational quintile transition matrix. We make them all the time at Brookings. Our days fly by as we just make another matrix. I'm going to show you a bunch of these. This is just quintiles now. I'm mostly going to be in quintiles, I think, for the rest of it. Where you're born in the bottom, where do you end up? So what were your parents' what was your parents' income? Which quintile were you in? And then where do you end up? So you only see 8% of the kids born into the bottom, 20% make it to the top. That's pretty high, actually. Most estimates are lower than that. But this one shows it pretty high. I'm going to show you the heterogeneity that lies behind that number. Meanwhile, those at the top are much more likely to stay at the top than fall to the bottom. So it's kind of stickiness. Basically, what we're saying is intergenerational stickiness in social mobility. In a utopian world where your parents' income didn't affect yours at all, every bar would be 20%, okay? Very simple concept. Everyone get it? Because I'm going to use a few of these. You wouldn't want that, of course, because imagine what you'd have to do to a world to get 20%. But nonetheless, this is a kind of standard way of approaching the problem. There are lots of different ways to do this, some of which I'll get into: rank, IGE, rank directional mobility, etc. But this is just a straightforward quintile transition. It has all kinds of problems, like if you're on the threshold, you move from the 19th to the 21st, you move quintiles. Meanwhile, if you move from the 1st to the 19th, that doesn't count. Right? So it's crude. Gives you a sense. Typically, we'll kind of focus on the bottom. How do we stop people getting stuck in poverty? I don't want people born poor to stay poor. Nobody wants that. I think it's fun to focus on the top a little bit too. Because relative mobility is a zero-sum game. I'm presenting to you now the idea of relative intergenerational social mobility based on income, right? And based on household income. Every single one of those words matters, all right? Because we're going to talk about absolute mobility in a moment. Relative mobility is where are you on the ladder relative to where your parents were on the ladder? And there's only so many rungs on the ladder. So for someone to go up, someone has to come down. It's a zero-sum game. Okay? Absolute mobility is, am I better off than my parents were? So does each generation is absolutely better off? That's a completely different measure of intergenerational mobility, which I'll show in a moment. But for the purposes of this is relative. Okay? So it's constrained. You can only fit. I told you I'm not an economist, but you can only get 20% of the population in each quintile. I know that for a fact. So that means that the relative upward mobility requires relative downward mobility. You can't have one without the other. That's not a moral statement, it's a mathematical statement, which is why relative mobility turns out to be less popular with policymakers than it first appears, which I'll get into. Now, we mentioned a little bit about the elasticity. I think the best summary, I don't think I put this on your reading list, I can't remember now, but a long piece by Florencia Torch that summarizes the literature. Was it on the reading list? Who's going to own up to not knowing what was on the reading list? It was, yeah. So, which I think is just a stunning summary. I think she's one of the best in the field. But she makes this kind of point in her summary of it, which is children of wealthy parents are more likely to be homogeneously wealthy than children of poor parents are likely to be homogeneously poor. There's more stickiness at the top than there is at the bottom, right? And I think that's pretty consistent. My view, having gone through this for the kind of book, is that actually, if you kind of look at it, actually, people don't tend to look that way, but if you start looking that way, there is more stickiness at the top than at the bottom, and it looks as if that's where the US stands out more than other countries, actually. I don't think the US is that different in terms of upward mobility from the bottom, relatively speaking. I'm reasonably convinced now there's not too much difference. And huge variation within the US, of course. But I do think the US stands out, and increasingly so, for its stickiness at the top. And this is what Florencia is saying here, really. And she has this fantastic quote from Marcus Yanti, who again is one of the, which is, perhaps the variation of the elasticity should be considered an index of mobility in addition to the elasticity. So what she's saying there is, so you might use the elasticity, the IGE that Steve talked to you about, as a measure of overall mobility. I think there are problems with the IGE, which we might get into, but nonetheless, it's a kind of measure, that elasticity measure, okay? But Florence's point is, yeah, but there's variation in the elasticity across the distribution. You just give me one number for the whole distribution. This is back to the point I made earlier about income inequality, which is a single measure of income inequality is going to disguise differences in the distribution. And so let's look at the variation of the elasticity across the distribution. That's what she does, and she finds that you're going to see a higher IGE at the top than at the bottom, and a higher IGE at the top than in the middle. In other words, more perpetuation of status at the top. So don't just take the IGE at face value, break it down. I want to know not is there growing immobility? I want to know where. And I think this is consistent, I can't remember what I've got next, this is idea that there's kind of more stickiness at the top in the US, and that may well be rising over time. I say may at this point, I'm not quite ready to say is. May be rising over time. It's consistent with the income inequality trends, and the educational inequality trends, and the spatial trends. So you're seeing more clustering of advantages at the top. You would expect that other things equal, I think, to maybe create more stickiness at the top. And that might change the way we think about the Great Gatsby curve, which I know Steve talked to you about. Now, of course, I mentioned that relative mobility is zero-sum. And you may have seen that some people will do exercises where they ask people to identify their ideal income distribution versus the actual distribution. You know, and everyone's like wildly socialist in theory, and then they show them the actual things, and they're fun. I don't set much store by them, but they're fun. But what some people do, some psychologists did, which I thought was interesting, was to ask people what they thought the ideal amount of relative intergenerational mobility would be. And they started off by asking them, take people who are born in the bottom 20%. Where do you think they should end up in the distribution, right? So we're taking poor people. I'm going to use poor as shorthand for the bottom 20% in much of what I say. As it turns out, it's not that far from the federal poverty line. It's good enough as a shorthand. So where do you want them to end up? And basically, as you can see, they just want them to end up completely equally distributed. They don't want there to be any association between being born poor and where you end up. But if anything, they broke into liberals and conservatives. This is the ideal world. If anything, the conservatives wanted them going all the way up to the top. Conservatives, they love the idea of poor people rising to the top of the distribution. Fantastic. Look, that is pretty much to a utopia, right? Compared to, this is now different data, this is Pew's data, on what actually happens to people from the bottom. So Pew only say 4% make it to the top. Raj has said 8, let's say 6. Small number. I think my numbers say 6. And a lot stuck at the bottom. The thing is, what has to happen for so many of these people to move into that top quintile? For all those people to move into that top quintile, what has to happen to that top quintile? People have to move out. So this is what I thought was brilliant about this study, was they then said to people, what do you think should happen to people in the top quintile? So it turns out that they nailed it. I mean, their ideal for stickiness at the top is pretty similar to the actual stickiness at the top, right? They don't really want people in the top 20% to fall down very much. I mean, a bit. But they want quite a lot to stay at the top. See the problem. And actually, if you do the math, which I did for a short piece that I wrote, I didn't ask about the middle quintiles. What this actually means is the people from the bottom would have to have much greater chance of getting to the top than the people in the middle in order for the people at the top to maintain their position, right? So basically, the kind of point is that everyone's in favor of the idea of upward mobility. The idea of downward mobility is very unpopular, I've discovered. Very few people are in favor of downward mobility. And very few people would be in favor of it for themselves or for their kids. Quite right too. Right? It would be something weird to be in favor of it. Although my middle son, who's just graduated high school, who knew a bit about my work, we had this sort of ritual. He'd come home with his report card from school, and he'd say, here's my report card, and he'd say, Dad, I have some good news and some bad news. Okay, great. The good news is, you're always going on about how we need more downward mobility out of the top quintile. And the bad news is, these are my grades. And then I would say, and we just did it over and over again, it became a ritual, and I would say, Well, this will certainly secure some downward mobility and create more room at the top for other people. So well done, son. On the other hand, anybody who is clever enough to make that joke should not be getting these grades, which you shouldn't. But with the exception of my son, there are very few people lining up to be downwardly mobile. I've done wealth here too, based on Fabian Pfeffer's work, again by quintile. And here he's just looking at the stickiness of wealth. Similar idea. What was the wealth of your parents? What's the wealth of you? Wealth is harder to measure than income, especially at the top. There are all kinds of problems with wealth measurement, which I've sort of played with a little bit. But nonetheless, this is pretty good. And as long as you're dealing with kind of like quintiles, you can get closer. It gets really tricky when you get into this kind of top 1%, 2%, just because of when they realize their capital gain, etc. It's very hard to do it well. But this is pretty good. And what it kind of shows you is that wealth is stickier than income. Your chances of being in the top quintile by wealth, if your parents are in the top quintile by wealth, are approaching 1 in 2. It's pretty good. And again, stickier at the top than at the bottom, as you would expect with wealth. Yes?
So my question regarding the previous two graphs would be, is it because it's just a function of cognitive bias in some sense that people mistake absolute versus relative? Because they belong to the top percentiles, they are unable to see what it is actually for the bottom percentile to move up, but they are actually able to conceive what it is to move down.
Yeah. So in other words, they're not understanding the trade-off. They're not seeing the zero sum. Is that what you mean?
Right. So that they actually don't understand that one is relative, one is absolute.
Yeah, I think that's true. And when we say people, I would include among that leading politicians and policymakers. So I've sat with leading politicians and policymakers with a version of this chart, say. Or you'll give them the odds ratios, and they'll say, that's outrageous, we've got to get more of these poor these people up to the top. And you say, yeah, that's great. You do know, by the way, that means more people are going to have to move down. And the politician goes, what? You go, yeah, you get the charts out again. They go, no, we don't want that. Okay. So you want to increase upward relative mobility, but you don't want to increase downward relative mobility. You can't do that, minister. So that's where they go, oh, no, okay, well, let's find another measure. Let's do absolute mobility instead, right, which I'm going to come on to. And I don't, I'm not naive about this. Of course, it's very hard to go out there and say, we want you to be less successful. No one's going to win an election that way. It's a terrible bumper sticker. But that's wealth, and I'm going to come on to education later. Now, absolute mobility have set me up perfectly for this, I would say now pretty famous finding from the Equality Opportunity Shop on absolute mobility. So using the IRS data again, what Raj and his colleagues done is to say, what percentage of people are making more than their parents for the different birth cohorts, for those born in 1940 up to those born in 1980. This is household income. And what you see is that for the population born in 1940, 90% became better off than their parents at the same age, compared to those in 1980, for whom the number is about 50%. And this has been widely reported as this kind of drop in absolute mobility. Now, there's a number of things to point out about this chart. One is it doesn't adjust for household size. If you adjust for household size, the 1980 number goes up to about 60%. So you can bump it by 10 percentage points by adjusting for household size, depending on which adjustment of household size you use. Raj actually reports 3 different ways to adjust for household size, because there are lots of different ways to adjust for household size. But use the one that most people do, which is the square root approach. It gets about 60%, right? Because of the change in the shape and the size of families over time. So the money's going further. And that's largely because of the rise in single-parent families and people living alone. Nonetheless, there's the trend. And it'll still be going down. You see the biggest drop is kind of in those early years, is kind of those early cohorts. And the trend is basically there. The slightly complex thing about this, which I'll point out to this group, is I've just done some work, published it last week, on the distribution of absolute mobility. Like where in the distribution are you seeing the biggest drops and rises? And part of the complexity with thinking about this is you're taking the kids' income when they reach a certain age. They're using mid-30s for most of this work, compared to the parents' income in their mid-30s. and what proportion surpass them? Well, first of all, it's just a binary. It's just like you get, like if you're $1 better off than them, tick. And it might be more interesting to be whether or not you're many dollars better off than them. But actually, more importantly, what it means is you've got to think not only about the experience of the people who were born in 1940, but their parents' experience. Okay, so you've got to think about it. If you're born in 1940, you're turning 20 in 1960. You're hitting the labour market in the early 60s. The US economy was growing at an average of 4% a year during the 60s, well, between 50 and 73 anyway. So you've got a really booming economy, big wage growth, kind of, et cetera. It was a pretty good time to hit the labour market. So that group, the boomers, got really pretty good time to hit the labour market. Think about their parents for a moment. If you're born in 1940, assume your parents were in their late 20s or 30s, they were in the Depression. Certainly during those years when they were being compared. So you've got to think about, like, where were they and where am I? So whenever you look at these absolute mobility things, think about the parents as well. Whereas, overcoming these people, like this is my parents' generation, no wonder it's so hard. I mean, they ate all the cake. They had an amazing time of it. As I said, 4% growth between 50 and 73. Not too much international trade. Highly unionized workplaces. It was just like the glorious 25 years. So no wonder it's so hard to overtake them for subsequent generations. It was easy for the boomers to overtake Depression-era parents. Pretty hard for those who came later to overtake the boomers. Right? So just that's baked in. We shouldn't just say, oh, that's terrible. Just think. We've got to think about both generations and where they were. Nonetheless, there's the finding, and it's getting lots of attention. But then what Raj and his team do is something quite interesting, which is to say there are largely two factors that are driving the drop in absolute mobility. One is slower growth, which I've already mentioned. If the economy is growing more slowly, it's going to be harder to overtake your parents, obviously, for more people to do that. Secondly, how is the growth distributed? What is the kind of distribution of that growth? Because if the economy is growing pretty well, but all of the money is going to 5 people over here, and no one else is getting any of it, then not many people are going to overcome their parents, okay? So you're seeing both. So what they did was something quite clever, which was to run a counterfactual. And so these two bars here are just showing you the ends of these lines here, the 90 and the 50. So this is the 40 cohort and the 80 cohort, the proportion, absolute mobility proportion who overtook their parents. And then what they kind of say, okay, well, let's just kind of keep growth constant in one model, but make us more equal. And in the other, keep equality where it is and push up growth to the level that it was before for that group. And run both of those counterfactuals. And what we kind of see is that both matter, but at least by their reckoning, inequality, the distribution of economic growth, is actually accounting for a bit more of the drop in absolute mobility than low growth itself. They both count, but by their estimates, about a third of the drop is explained by low growth, and about 2/3 of the drop is explained by the distribution of that growth. And putting it very crudely, it's a very sophisticated analysis. That's quite instructive and quite useful. What I don't know is whether that will still be true for the later cohorts, for the 50 cohorts and so on, because there's something, as my work just showed, there's something quite odd about the 40 cohort compared to the 50 and later cohorts in their own work. So I'm a little bit less sure of the 40 cohort than I am of the 50 cohort. Plus, people who are born in 40 weren't having their kids in 1980. People are having their kids now in their late 20s. So better to look at the 1950 one, which is what I do. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the relationship between... Yes, please.
Could you talk more about what you think were the structural problems behind this trend, or what do you think was the difference between then and now that has caused this?
Well, I've mentioned some of them kind of already. So you had this exceptional period in the post-war years in the US of very high growth, pretty evenly distributed. And that does look quite exceptional historically to have had that combination of factors. And so there's a whole generation that were effectively kind of almost, and then there are big exceptions here, of course, because black Americans in particular were locked out of many of the labor market opportunities during that time. But nonetheless, as a general point, the kind of whole population was lifted up pretty fast, certainly by comparison to the Depression era parents. So I just do think that just raw levels of economic growth. And I think the problem is that many people have come to see that as the norm rather than the exception. So a lot of the debates now about inequality are saying, look what we were like, and look what it was like, how much people were better off and how equal we were. well, we had so much money then, so much growth then, that you've got a whole generation whose mindset of what's normal was set during that period. We ain't going to get back to 4% growth. Certainly not for 20 years. I mean, just not. I don't think. Maybe I'm being a pessimist. Maybe I've read too much Robert Gordon. But I do not see an easy path for us to get back any kind of like that growth, right? We could certainly do better in terms of distribution. But in a sense, it's just that there's nothing I see on the horizon that's going to dramatically change the fact that we're in a much lower growth world now. And we're in a lower productivity world now too, for various reasons that are well beyond my knowledge. So those are the main factors. Plus, we're seeing a drop in dynamism more generally. Economic growth. It's not as if economic growth just drops down on us as a gift from heaven. It's not like manna from heaven. It's a result of decisions by people, and we're seeing significant drops in business startup rates, except from immigrants. We're seeing significant reductions in people moving across state lines to jobs. We're seeing dropping labor force participation. And so actually I think that particularly among white Americans who are now median age 46, you're seeing this kind of bit of a loss of economic dynamism, partly because of pessimism. So there's this kind of effect here. So I think the US is just becoming a less dynamic economy. And my real fear actually is that it kind of locks in, at least among some populations, including middle-aged whites and above. But pessimism becomes, in economics, pessimism is self-fulfilling, right? I mean, just in the same way that animal spirits, psychology really matters for economics. And it's interesting to me now that when we talk about the plight of many people who are being left behind, we use terms from psychology. We use despairing, resentful, afraid, angry, anxious. So we take all these terms from psychology to describe what's happening to people, and then we come up with economic policies to help them. An earned income tax credit for childless workers, a big apprenticeship scheme, free community college. So it's interesting because we've just diagnosed what's close to a psychological problem, which we think we're going to have economic solutions to. I actually think the psychological problem is in of itself an economic problem. So there's this relationship between relative and absolute mobility, which I want to play with a bit, and which I talk a bit about kind of in the book. Because so I've talked about relative, zero sum, right? Absolute, overtake your parents, not zero sum. Because as you can see, most people can be better off than their parents. In theory, everyone can be better off than their parents, right? We just grow more and give them money away. So there's no trade-off in absolute mobility in the same way. But there may well be a relationship between the two of them, at least in terms of how it plays through into the political economy. And this is an analogy that Steve Pearlstein, who writes for the Washington Post, gave me, which is to imagine a world where you're all driving along a highway like this. Right? Everyone's driving along, open road, no problem. You're driving at 55 miles an hour, or whatever the absurd speed limit is here. What is it, 50, 60? But anyway, low. But everyone's driving legally like that. And you're overtaken. Right? You're going 54 miles an hour. You're overtaken by someone else going 57 miles an hour. Do you care? No. You don't care, do you? Or if you do, you have bigger problems. Just like, then you do need a psychologist. But most of us don't care. Like, we're all getting there, aren't we? It's not a problem. They're going a bit faster than me. They've overtaken me. That is a good analogy for relative mobility in an era of high absolute mobility. Right? So here, absolute mobility is represented by we're all getting there. Right? The speed of the cars is representative of economic growth. We're all getting better off. Right? Everyone's getting better. We're all getting there in good time. If I drop a quintile, someone's overtaken me. It's no biggie. That quintile is still going to be way better than the quintile my parents were in, even though it was one higher. Okay? So it, in a way, sort of takes some of the heat out of relative mobility if there's higher absolute mobility. Contrast with this, right, an era of low absolute mobility. People aren't moving as quickly. We're stuck. So it feels like we're not getting there all together, right? And then somebody cuts in. You feel like someone's cutting in here, right? Then how do you feel? Yeah? Yeah, then you're angry, aren't you? Yeah? Or if you're not, there's something wrong with you. Because you're angry, because you've got a sense of, look, we're all stuck. And so then I think, the stakes around relative mobility, around the sense of where you are relative to each other, increases with a drop in absolute mobility, even though it's irrational in some ways, because the truth is that let's say you were here and they cut in front of you, and that means that they get to the stoplight, 1 second ahead of you, and it means you're stuck one space behind, but no one's going anywhere anyway. You still really resent it in the kind of sense. And so actually I think that the politics of improving relative mobility, lowering the stakes of relative mobility, to some extent may rely on increasing absolute mobility. So to that extent, they are related. They're not, obviously they're economically distinct, but I think they're politically related. And I think one of the reasons why people are so concerned about their status and resorting to dream hoarding in many ways come from a sense of the stakes are just higher. That downward relative mobility is going to be a lot more painful than it would be in an era of high economic growth. Now, I said I was going to do something about the IGE, and I'll just say this very, very briefly, relative to other measures of intergenerational mobility. I've written a couple of pieces on measuring relative mobility. I wrote with Joanna Venator, who's now a PhD student at the University of Madison, Wisconsin in econ. And what we did was actually inspired by work from Scott Winship, who's currently the Joint Economic Committee and a good sort of center-right scholar. I mean, probably the leading center-right scholar on these issues. There are very few center-right scholars who know their numbers, because almost by definition, the people who are interested in this stuff tend to be center-left. And so there are very few, but Scott is one of the few, so I recommend his work. So inspired by him to look at different scenarios. And the point here simply is, I'm not going to labor it, because I know Steve talked about IGE, is that one of the problems with intergenerational elasticity measures, any elasticity measure, is it's sensitive to a change in the distribution of income between the 2 points in time you're measuring. All right? So if the society becomes more or less equal, even if there's no change in mobility in terms of rank terms, the IGE will change. Okay, the IGE will, right? We're all getting that. And so all we did was we simply just ran some scenarios, a bit like the Chetty ones before, which is to kind of we did a scenario where it stays kind of equally immobile, but it's equalizing, and then another where it's still unequal, but getting more mobile, and seeing what happens to the IGE, and another measure of mobility, which is rank-rank. So rank is not sensitive, because all that rank does is say, what rank were your parents, what rank are you, and what's the coefficient between the two of them. And there are, let's say there are 100 ranks. Your parents will rank 34, your rank 54, or rank whatever, and I'm just going to look at the relationship between your rank and your parents' rank. And there are a fixed number of ranks in a society at both points in time. So it doesn't matter if the gap between the ranks has grown quite significantly or has shrunk quite significantly, I'm still looking at rank. It's insensitive to inequality. The IGE is sensitive to changes in the distribution over time. Now, that might not matter for some purposes, but it does matter for other purposes. It might matter if you're comparing mobility against inequality, for example, in different countries at different points in time. Because what you'll see is, and so you need to be very careful, as the Gatsby curve does, very careful if you put the Gini coefficient on one axis and the IGE on another axis, be real careful about interpreting those results, because the IGE in and of itself is partially capturing changes in inequality. All right, so the two things you're comparing, one of them contains elements of the other, which is one reason to be a bit skeptical about some of the ways in which the Gatsby curve stuff is used. And it's one of the reasons why I like rank-rank, or quintile transitions, or rank directional, because I can then look at them separately. Okay? I can look at what's happening to the income distribution at different points in time, and then I can look at what's happening to intergenerational mobility rank by rank. So I'm not going to be blind to the fact that the ranks might be doing this or doing this. I'm going to be fully aware of that, but I'm then going to separately and cleanly look at the relationship between rank of parent and rank of kid. Okay, it's fine to look at all of them. They all have advantages and disadvantages. IG is very popular for many reasons, partly because it's easy to calculate for lots of different countries. Right? There is just a data availability issue around it. But you've got that warning, right, in your head, which is that they don't necessarily act in the same way. And what this shows you is that by changing these two societies in these two rather different ways, I can change the IGE and the rank in very different ways. In the longer papers, we also talk about rank directional mobility and other measures of looking at inequality across generations, and they can generate very different results. So again, look at the left-hand axis, the choice of measures in inequality really, really matters. And so when you're doing social science in this area, before you just choose a measure, what measure of inequality am I going to use from the 1,000 I could possibly use, right? Don't just think, oh, Gini, that's a good one, or IGE, that's a good one, everyone uses that. Stop and say, what am I trying to measure and why? What is the motivation behind measuring this measure of measuring inequality? What am I trying to get at here? And then what's the most appropriate measure for that? So don't jump into a measure and don't just say, well, if there's a sentence, I've just used the standard measure of inequality, the Gini coefficient. Well, really? Okay, fine. But are you sure it was the right measure for this? There are so many different ways to measure inequality. And I very much appreciate it when scholars take the time to think hard about which is the right measure for their work, and then to explain to me why that was the right measure for their work. And even better, to tell me how it would have been different, how the results would have been different with another measure. Because then I know that they're doing good, hands above the table, clean social science, recognizing that our results are sensitive to our measures, what we do with the zeros, what we do, which deflator we choose, whether we choose 10-50, 50-90, or 10-50, 50-95, just for fun, or whatever, right? So every chart you see, you could be being sold something. In fact, almost always you're being sold something. So you can break it down in that way. Okay. I've shown that it endures across generations. Now, what I'm going to very briefly do is talk about these kind of 4 factors which we have to take into account when we're looking at the endurance of inequality across generations: family, education, race, and geography. So first one, family. Okay, so you're now all familiar with quintile transition matrices. So you understand what I'm doing here. So what this does, this uses a national longitudinal survey of youth. So it's a restricted sample. It's pretty good. It's what people use, that or PSID is what we had to use before Raj got the IRS data. But this is what we use here to look at the income quintile at birth. And yeah, so it's a standard income inequality, intergenerational quintile transition matrix. But we do it for different groups. Those whose kids, I'll come to in just a sec. Those whose kids whose mother, we have to peg it to the mother, wasn't married at all throughout their childhood. So from 0 to 18, not married at all. Over the middle, kids whose mother was married from birth all the way through to 18. And then on the right, kids whose mothers were married for some of those years, but not all of them. And then I'm looking at the outcomes for the kids from those different quintiles. Yes?
Like on the line of choosing correct measure, I just want to ask that this IGE measure, does it put origin, independence from origin or not?
Oh, you're going back to the IGE?
Yeah.
Sorry, what's the question again?
Like, does this IGE measure puts independence from origin or not?
Does it work independently of the origin
Yeah.
of where the child is?
Origin from parents, like what social factors they were.
Oh, I see. Oh, I see. No. So the IGE typically is, let's say it's the IGE on income or earnings. It's used a lot for earnings. It will just take the earnings of the parent and the kid across the whole of society and then create one number from all of that. So it doesn't take anything. I think you're asking, does it take anything else into account? No, it doesn't take anything else into account. I don't know the education of the kid. I don't know the background. I don't know the race. I just know for the whole of the society, what's the elasticity between that generation's earnings and that generation.
Is it possible to put this independence from origin in any measure, like via any measure?
I don't know.
Okay.
That's the honest answer. I bet you there are people in the room who will know better than me. Steve would know. Ask Steve. Loves that kind of stuff. This is just descriptive data, but you can see, look, this is the never married. Just focus on quintile 1. Kids from the poorest quintile, whose mothers weren't married at all throughout their childhood, have a 50% chance of being stuck at the bottom and a 5% chance of making it to the top. Compare that to the continuously married, they have a 17% chance of being stuck at the bottom and a 19% chance of making it to the top. Again, just descriptive, and then continuously somewhere in the middle, right? Now, there's going to be something, I can't actually off the top of my head remember the exact numbers, but I think the never married is probably fewer than 1 in 5. Not that many kids are raised by mothers who don't get married at all throughout their childhood. So it's kind of relatively small group. And we don't have any in quintiles 4 and 5. Almost, by definition, just the ends aren't big enough at that point. But then it just shows purely descriptively that kids in low income, bottom 20% households, whose mothers were married throughout their childhood, have a significantly higher chance of being upwardly mobile, relatively speaking, than kids whose mother was not married at all through their child. So I'm not controlling for income. Other people have kind of done that. I'm just giving descriptive data for different income buckets. Okay? So there's something going on here. What that thing is, we can discuss at great length. Because kind of parenting, communities, etc. I think that the work around the role of community is becoming more important than now some of the stuff on household. I'll just show this kind of briefly. Marriage rates, and I can't remember, I think it says by the age of 40. I'd have to check. Should have put it on there. I apologize. And of course, the composition of these groups is changing over time. There aren't as many people now who've got less than high school, etc. So the numbers within each line are changing. So I'm not comparing like with like. There's a big problem with using educational credentials as your measure because the numbers in each group change. But this is simply to make the point that in 1970, there wasn't much difference in the marriage rates for by education. And now there is. So you see there's been a decline, but since 1990 at least, it's been flat for women with college degrees. So we can now, it's gone up a little bit since, we can now say, without much exaggeration, that college-educated American women are as likely to get married as their mothers and somewhat more likely to stay married than their mothers. So there is no retreat from marriage among college-educated Americans. And if you look internationally, that's true as well. And college-educated Americans' marriages are as likely to survive as college-educated Britons or Swedes' marriages are to survive too. So there's this real big difference now, you'll see, in family structure. So my colleague Belle Sawhill says that family formation is the new class divide in America. Right? It's a great line. I think there's lots of other class divides. My point is simply that these things are clustering more tightly together. Because you'll see, kind of, as women have entered the labor market, their earnings have gone up, and they're tending to assortatively mate with other men who've got college degrees. So assortative mating is the tendency to marry someone like yourself, in this case by education background, and that seems to have risen, partly because it can, because there's a lot of women college graduates now. What that means is you've got 2 college graduates in the house who tend to get married before they have kids, and you've got 2 labor market participants at reasonably high levels. The only men in the US who haven't seen who've seen a big increase in their earnings are college-educated men. Meanwhile, college-educated women have seen the biggest increase by some margin in their earnings. Put them together into a household. That's why household income is very important, separate to individual earnings, and you'll see some of the trends that I mentioned earlier. Right? So family formation, family structure, and size of family is a very, very big factor when it comes to thinking about inequality, and maybe intergenerational mobility too. This is from Putnam, which is using the American Time Use Survey, which is just developmental time spent with parents by the education of the mother. Don't ask me to define developmental time. I don't know. But there's some definition of, it's the difference between sticking your kid in front of the TV and telling them to shut up and talking to them, I guess. I'm not an expert. But all it's kind of showing here is that there's been a really, these, you can see for the years across the top, really very significant increase in the amount of time that parents are spending kind of developmentally with their kids, but actually a growing class gap. Blue is the mothers and red is the fathers. And so you're really kind of seeing that the kind of more educated parents are spending more time in that developmental relationship with their kind of kids. So parenting styles are not diverging exactly, but they're going up for everybody, but it's just that they're going up faster for the people at the top. Whereas there used to be no difference at all. I mean, there wasn't much. Everyone just stuck their kid in front of the TV and told them to shut up. Right? That's how my parents raised me. They won't watch this. Not true, but do you remember there was a sort of benign neglect of all parents, in fact. And I can't prove this, but I reckon the year things started to change was when parent became a verb. When did it become a verb? I need to find out. Because I remember the first time I said to my parents, parenting. They went, parenting? What's parenting? I said, it's what you do as a parent. They're like, you mean have kids? No, parenting. My parents were like, what are you talking about? Their generation had kids. We parent. This is from Ariel Khalil, who's actually, she's here, she's at the Harris School, who's done a lot of work on the parenting gap. And I kind of quote from her, I can give you all the sources, but the basic kind of point is that in terms of this kind of, the learning environment, as the psychologists call it, the main gap is top income families pulling away from middle and low income counterparts. So it's not the middle pulling away from the bottom, it's the top pulling away from everybody else. It's just this kind of cultivated, concerted cultivation of upper middle class parents of their kids, at an extreme, it's like helicopter parents, right? Education. Now, this is median family income for the highest educated person in each household over time. I'll put the chart up. I don't really like it. And I mean, it gives you the bare facts, but the reason I don't like it is what I referred to earlier, is because there's big now I'm going back to 64. There are huge compositional changes in these groups. So you're talking about someone very different, right? So you think about someone who's kind of didn't graduate high school or just graduated high school kind of back in the 60s, 70s, compared to someone now, they're a different group. They're a different group. Okay? You're comparing a third of the population to, 10% of the population. By definition, you're talking about a significantly more disadvantaged group because of the compositional shift. So I put it up, and you'll see a lot of these charts using the educational credential kind of, but I'm just the warning, the alarm that should always go off is, but hold on, there are a lot fewer people in that line now, and there's a lot more people in that line now. So the shift, and so in a sense, you shouldn't assume that the group is the same. The people who don't graduate high school today almost certainly have much deeper problems of one kind or another than the people who didn't graduate high school in the 60s, or the people who just have a high school diploma now, compared to someone who had a high school diploma in the 70s. They're different kinds of people in a way that it's hard to measure, but it's very important to bear in mind. Yes?
I had a question about, because on y-axis we have median family
Yeah.
income, and
Yeah.
about degrees, so is it like the head of the household?
Yeah, it's the highest educated person in that household. So it very often is the head, because that will very often how it will be defined, but it's just whoever's in there. Yeah. Now, here's one more quintile transition matrix, intergenerational quintile transition matrix, this time for education. So I did income, done wealth, now I'm doing education. This is a bit more complicated because, of course, education is not a continuous variable. So how do you put it into quintiles? And there is a way to do it, which we talk about in the piece, which we basically borrow Brad Hirschbein's approach to this when he's done work using PSID, and we use PSID for this work, again, with Joanna Venator, who I mentioned earlier. Because you have to smooth the distribution. The way the distribution of education, it's very blocky, as you can imagine. So how do you smooth that into quintiles? And there is a way to do that. But all this shows, so given all that, if you just accept that on face value, then you'll see that education's even stickier than wealth or income. Here we use the father's education, but the kid's education. And the reason we use the father's education is because there's been such a dramatic shift in women's education during the period in question. And so interpreting the results would be harder, given that there are just so many more women who are so much better educated than their mothers were because of that big shift in society. So we use fathers, but then either sons or daughters. And you'll see that the top quintile by education is very sticky indeed. It's 46% of those whose fathers are in the top education quintile now in it. So that's changed. Of course, getting into the top quintile has changed over time. So I think that for the generation we used here, this is PSID. So we went, I can't remember what the cohorts were, 80s versus 60s or something. Is that just obviously the barrier, the line that gets you into the top quintile is different now. Basically, for the current generation, it's a college degree, a 4-year college degree. It used to be some college. Okay, so what gets you into the quintile has changed. That's the point. But the stickiness of the quintiles is quite striking, especially at the top. This just shows you NLSY, which shows you, again, looking back, so we have to kind of go all the way back to just see the outcomes of people who didn't graduate high school, those who graduated high school, and I'll just focus on this, which is college graduates. So for those who get a 4-year college degree, you'll see that actually it certainly doesn't remove the impact of background, but it significantly reduces it. And you'll see that for that bottom quintile, actually they're more likely to make it to the top if they get a 4-year college degree. So getting a 4-year college degree is a very powerful upward mobility move. Of course, those who are at the top who get a 4-year college degree, they're still stickier. 37% of them stay at the top. And this 16% could be compared to this 16%, which is kids who are born at the top and didn't graduate high school, have the same chance of ending up in the top quintile as kids who are born poor and got a 4-year college degree. So that's to say that education really is very powerful as a mobility tool, but it certainly doesn't wipe out the effects of background as those numbers show. I'm just, where have I got to? I'm going to pause in a moment. Yeah, okay. So I'll do education, I'm going to pause, and then I can do race and geography pretty quickly when we reconvene. So again, this doesn't say, but Chetty. their college scorecards work. And what this does is I think it's something that's quite clever. You take the rank of parents and the rank of the child, so just going to straight rank comparison. So I'm happy. It's very clean way of measuring the relationship. So the grey line is showing you for the whole population, the relationship between parent rank, kids rank. A very strong correlation, as you can see. And you can see the size of the slope. But then what they do is they look at the same rank for people who went to different kinds of colleges. So the green line is for elite colleges, and the orange line is for other four-year colleges. So this is the relationship between the parent's income and the kid's income conditional on having attended either a four-year college for the orange line or an elite college for the green line. And again, there's a very big data set behind this, so there's very, very little we don't have to worry too much about standard errors in this stuff. So what it's telling you is just like elite colleges for now. The fact that the line is high tells you that people who go to elite colleges tend to do quite well. Surprise, right? In a sense, that's not the finding. The finding is that the line is almost flat. It's not quite flat, but it's almost flat. What that tells me is that conditional on going to an elite college, your outcomes are going to be pretty much the same as someone else. So if you're poor and you go to Harvard, you're going to do as well as if you're rich and go to Harvard, basically. So it's not, the line isn't quite as flat for the 4 years, but it's still pretty good. Right? If you get into a kind of four-year college, then you're seeing this dramatic effect of an almost horizontal line conditional on going to those colleges. That's great news. This is Horace Mann would be thrilled. Education is the great equalizer. So that's the good news. Here's the bad news. This is again from Raj's work, and I think one of the most elegant and terrifying charts that I have seen in recent social science. This is straightforward correlation between your parents' income rank and your percentage chances of attending college between the ages of 18 and 21. So mature students are not in there. That's obviously going to change the results. But in terms of the typical journey to college, in those 18 to kind of 21-year-old years, who does it and who doesn't? By their parents' income. And again, because he has all of the IRS data, we have no standard errors, really, to mention. And you know how sometimes someone will do like a scatter plot, and then they'll put a regression line through it, and they'll put it, and they'll say, look, it's statistically significant, and you're like squinting at it and going, really? And you can't quite see it, and you have to trust the line, and you're like, yeah, I'm not sure. You know, and those lines are best fit, so that's horrible. They did put the regression line in here, but I'm not sure they needed to. The fact, look at the 0.67. So what? I've got a 2/3 chance of knowing whether you're going to go to college, and all I need to know is your parents' income? Okay. So in terms of education and the role of education in terms of promoting upward mobility, yay! Oh. Conditional on. And as we'll see later in the meritocracy bit, the problem is there's almost nobody in those dots on the left, as this chart shows. So education in theory is the great equalizer. In practice, it's the great stratifier. Not because education doesn't work conditional on getting education, it's just the people who get the education, which I'll move on to. Okay, so it's 35 past. I'll pause, but take 2 more questions before I do it. Yes, you go.
With the term for, is that people who actually finish college? Or
No, just attending college.
Just attending.
Yeah, one of the slight weaknesses in the IRS data is we actually don't know whether they graduated. We can tell from the IRS data because of what you have to file whether they enrolled, whether they attended. So we've got attendance, we don't have completion. However, for the elites anyway, they all graduate, pretty much. It's a bit less true for some of the others. So yeah, it's a great question. And the honest answer is that we don't know. And it's the same for these. Yes?
If the access to education was much more easier than what it is now, we would see a market difference anyway, because there are just way too many people in the labor market that simply don't have enough jobs. And then we have a problem of different sort of skill difference. There is going to be a skill
Sure.
because you're getting paid for the skills.
Yeah, because you change. Yes, because you're changing what's happening on the supply side. Absolutely, it will have an impact on the labour market, and already we're seeing that. So we know that there's a good return to a 4-year college degree or more. Most of the data is presented as 4-year college degree plus, kind of or more. But if you unpack that, you'll see that particularly in kind of recent years, that's really being driven by people with the more. It's been driven by you. It's been driven by the people with master's degrees and kind of PhDs. And so it's, in a sense, it's a kind of race. It's a positional good in the labour market, and it has exactly the effect you do. We're seeing a levelling out of the return to 4-year college, and that plus thing has been pulled up by the return to people with masters and PhDs. So it's exactly right. Yeah. Intergenerational mobility. So we've talked about family, we've talked about education. Now we're going to talk about race and geography. So let's start with race. More intergenerational quintile transition matrices, which you're all familiar with now. And what this does, this is using NLSY. So again, we're backward looking because I need to know what happens when they're in their 40s. In this case, around the age of 40. But I'm showing income quintile at birth. For black and white Americans, the income, this is just pure descriptive data. I've subsequently done some work with Scott Winship, which looks by gender as well, which we're basically beaten to that by Raj Chetty, which I'll talk about in a moment. But just purely descriptively, again, what you can see is huge race gaps here. Look at the bottom quintile. So these are people who are born into the bottom 20% of the distribution. If you're black, you have a 51% chance of staying there and a 3% chance of making it to the top. I'm using chance very loosely here, and you'll see why that's a problem in a moment. So I should say that the odds ratio for black Americans is 51 and 3, whereas for whites it's 23 and 16. So at least just purely descriptively, for that cohort, the black Americans were twice as likely to be stuck in poverty as white Americans. But also the middle quintile is in some ways more instructive because you can see in the middle quintile of those who were kind of born into the middle, and there's no top quintile for black Americans because there aren't enough black Americans in the top quintile for the cohort. But you're going to see some significant downward relative mobility for black Americans from that middle quintile. So 70% will drop down, relatively speaking, from the middle quintile, which is compared to 34% of white Americans. So I'm now comparing this bar here to this bar here. And again, this is purely descriptive data. Right? I'm not controlling for anything. There's nothing else in here. It's just the income descriptive data. But so what you can see is that, at least on the basis of these pure descriptions, that black Americans who were born, let's say, roughly 40 years ago to low-income parents were twice as likely to be stuck in poverty themselves when they reached 40. And if they were born to middle-income parents roughly 40 years ago, they're twice as likely to be downwardly mobile from the middle as white Americans. So it's not just that there's less upward mobility, there's much more downward mobility for black Americans. And I think we understand that because the particular mobility patterns of black Americans is a significant factor in the overall mobility statistics for the US and weighs particularly heavily when we're doing longitudinal studies, which are, because they're intergenerational, that white and black Americans are pretty likely to have had parents here, and so we can track them pretty well. That's not true for more recent immigrants. So it's very hard for them. I'm not going to show you, for example, Hispanic, because they're not quite ready yet. We don't have enough sample size yet of people whose parents were born here. And obviously immigrants are going to be very different in many different ways. Why? And this is just now, I'm talking about Chetty's work. This is the latest paper out of the Equality of Opportunity Project, which just looks at what was the income, household income percentile based on the parents' income percentile for those different groups. So you're just basically seeing, all you're seeing, these are rank lines across the distribution, comparing parents' rank, kids' rank for those different racial groups. And what you can see is that it's significantly lower for black and lower for American Indian. One of the great things about having all the IRS data is that means that you can get much crunchier with groups you couldn't possibly get in other longitudinal surveys. So you've got, for example, American Indians in there, and he has got Hispanic in there because, again, he's got the whole IRS data set, so he can do more with that. And then you'll see white and Asian kind of higher up. So very significantly lower mobility, at least measured in that rank way, for black Americans and American Indians, and somewhat less for Hispanic than for white and for Asian Americans. You'll also see just kind of at the bottom distribution here that actually Asian Americans are more likely to kind of rise up the rank relative to their kids if they're from the bottom 50%, their parents are bottom 50%, by comparison to white. So look at the green line right there at the bottom. So you're seeing this very strong upward mobility in the bottom third, say, of the distribution for Asian Americans. Then the lines cross, and basically they just go alongside each other up until the top. Yes?
So I have a question about, like, typically the right of the discussion has this solution that rising type raises all boats. So can you say that works for the Asian Americans and white Americans, perhaps doesn't work for the others? Or is it like there are structural immobility issues within races?
Yeah, so I think the way I would describe it is that you need the tide to be rising to raise any boats. But then the question, you're quite right, is to say which boat. Do different boats rise differently, right? And the answer is yes, they do. And you can see that in the data. Because we're tracking people at the same points in time for different racial groups, this is the same economy, the same labor market that people are hitting, and you're seeing these very different outcomes. And so there are very clearly racial differences in the relationship between your parents' income, your own income, and their chances of loosening, as well as massive differences in the aggregate numbers of people in those groups. Okay? So I'm not showing that. I'm not showing that there are way more black kids who are born into poor households. I'm just showing the relationship between being born into a poor household and staying kind of poor. And this kind of the Asian story shows up very strongly. I won't show it here, but separate charts will show that a big part of the Asian story is immigration. If you compare mobility rates for Asian Americans with parents who are born here, they're pretty similar to white. That upward lift at the bottom, in that bottom third, is from Asian Americans whose kind of parents kind of moved here. Why? So just going to very briefly go through this. This is obviously a very long conversation, a whole separate talk in some ways. But just kind of ponder on some of the reasons why you see this specific experience for black Americans and why their mobility is so much lower upwards and higher and more downwards mobility for black Americans. One is just wealth. This is just showing you very, very crudely that there are massive differences in assets. So maybe one of the reasons back here why you see this downward mobility from the middle is this is just income. But if you hold income constant, black Americans are much less likely to have assets. These are just the median wealth figures for black and white overall. But even in that middle income quintile, the black Americans are very, very low on assets by comparison to the white Americans. And that's for obvious reasons. And I think Richard Rothstein's book, The Color of Law, does a brilliant job of describing the way the housing market and discrimination has locked out black Americans from the principal wealth generating mechanisms enjoyed by white Americans. But why would that matter for mobility? Well, it gives you a buffer against a shock. It means you can make some strategic investments in your kids at various points in time. You can help them buy a car. You can help them put down a deposit on an apartment that allows them to live in a high opportunity. There are various ways in which that might work. We don't know. It's hard to know for sure, although there's more data coming on that. It could be skills, education, or skills at least in terms of education. So if you look now, and here we're just looking at, I've restricted this to women and men aged 25 to 35. Okay, so I've really narrowed the age range here, and again, trying to be hands above the table about what I'm doing. And the reason for that is just because if you go back in time, of course, there are these massive race differences in access to education. So this was just for, and then we've pooled American ACS data for 2008 to 12 to then just look at, of those 25 to 35, what education had they got by that point by gender and race. And what you're kind of seeing is very big differences, of course, by both gender and race. But you're seeing particularly kind of for black Americans, really much lower. And if you look at the trend, I won't show the trend here, is that black women are kind of, the line is moving much more steeply upwards than it is for black men. But overall, you're just kind of seeing these kind of huge differences. And obviously, 37% of white women in that age group with a bachelor's degree or more and come to college, which is now more than men. I think that's pretty well known now that white women have overtaken white men, still ahead of both women and men, but put them together and you see these big race gaps in education. Another way to think about skills, I apologize for this chart, this is Bash Mazumdar's work. Bash Mazumdar is an economist working at the Chicago Fed, who I think is one of the best intergenerational mobility researchers. And what he's done is he's looked at transition mobilities for black and white, but then he's added some controls. So he's using a National Longitudinal Survey of Youth. That contains within it something called the AFQT, the Armed Forces Qualification Test, which is administered in adolescents between the ages of kind of 15 and 18. And it's kind of like supposed to be a bit like a testing cognitive ability. There are some problems with it, with this test, no doubt, and some of them are well documented, but it holds up pretty well to some kind of robustness, just as a kind of sense of how much have you learned, what sort of skills do you have by that kind of time. And what he's done here is he's looked at your chances of getting out of the bottom quintile and your probability of moving down out of the top half is the one on the right, but then he's controlled for AFQT. So what Bash says is the differences you're seeing in black and white mobility using his NLSY data can be largely explained, at least statistically, by that measure of skill which is taken in adolescence. Right? So it's the formation of human capital up to the age of 18 that he's kind of doing. And I think that's kind of important when we think about what's lying behind this, is that it's how you hit the labour market and the skills that are acquired along the way, and obviously that's going to hugely affect your chance of getting into college, etc., etc. Yes?
Bosch in the same paper has like a beautiful graph with like returns to schooling or returns to college versus IGE, and it just is a one-to-one match.
Yes, you're right, actually, he does, and I should have included that. That's good, but I recommend the paper, sorry. Bash is just doing really kind of careful, mostly quite quietly, I would say, just out of Chicago Fed doing some of this very interesting work using NLSY. He's a really good researcher. The other possibility is it's something to do with, I talked about family before, but family structure, family stability. Most kids, most black families with children are single-parent families now, have been for, as you can see, for kind of some time. The lines are pretty flat, but there's a huge gap, and so you might think, okay, so this is not income or anything; it's just across the whole group. But you might think that some of these middle quintile households, black households, are made up of single mothers. So you say you're a black single mother, you've done well enough to get yourself into that middle income quintile, but you're still a single mother. That means there's more risk, there's more volatility, you're less likely to build wealth, and you're under more stress. So it's possible that there's something about the kind of family stress that's behind it too. And then penultimate point is about men, and I'm back to Raj's work now, where he's looking at, again, we're just kind of looking at this nice way of looking at it, which is percentile of parents' income, your percentile, just a rank, which, as I've said, is clean and I like it, and look at it for men and for women. Men on the left, women on the right. This was illustrated beautifully in the New York Times when this paper came out, which showed the differences in mobility transitions for black men and women. And so it looks as if gender is a very big part of the race story. Gender is important in and of itself too, but as you can see, actually, the lines are basically the same for black and white women in terms of the impact of their background on kind of where they end up. Now, there are many, many, many more black women in these lower income households to start with. Let's go make that point again. But the interesting from our point of view is no gap. Contrast to men, where there's a pretty significant gap. So essentially, the mobility gap, at least as measured by Chetty, between black and white, seems to essentially be a story about black men. Less so about black women, and as I've said, black women's educational attainment is rising rapidly, hasn't caught up yet with white men, but it will. It's not true of black men in terms of the trend. And then somewhat related, there's an issue about kind of community and place. I'm going to get into geography. This will allow me to segue into place and kind of geography. And again, bouncing off the kind of Chetty results, right? So there's something about places and being in these kind of particularly kind of segregated areas, something that's different about the place. And so what they do in their latest report is they look at kids on two measures, right? They say, are they low poverty neighborhoods? So that's neighborhoods with more than a certain percentage of households in poverty. And I can't now remember what that number is, but they're kind of poor areas. And then, the other way around. Low poverty areas where there's only a low proportion of people in poverty, so it's a non-poor area, and then with many fathers present. And the reason they've kind of put that in is because they're finding that for black boys, a pretty strong correlate with upward mobility was living in a place where there were lots of fathers around. Critically independent of whether their own father was around. It's a critical point. So we tended, as I've done earlier, to think about the household. You might say parents matter, dads matter, but you might think about that in the sense of a particular family. It turns out that the presence of lots of dads in the neighborhood affects the upward mobility of a black boy, independent of whether or not his own father is present. In fact, it's a stronger effect than his own father being present, is other fathers being present, which is a fascinating finding, so I'll come to you. And so what we just do is say, okay, let's take those two factors. It's a low poverty area with lots of dads around. Let's see what proportion of white kids live in an area like that compared to black kids. And then the other way around, high poverty neighborhoods with very few dads around. Let's see what proportion of white kids and black kids live in there. So what it's telling you is that 2/3 of black kids live in poor neighborhoods where there aren't very many dads around, by comparison to 1% of white kids. So the reason I like that is it's putting together a kind of economic variable with a social variable, and then just doing the descriptive data. And what is it, think about those neighborhoods. Think about living in those sorts of places. What is it about those places that's kind of helping people? Yes, there was a question there. Yeah. Rosalia. Huh?
How are you defining father? Is it like a person who's just a male who's had a kid, or is it a male who's like involved in their child's life, or is it someone who's actually married to someone else? Like, how are you?
So it's not. They don't have to be married to. And the honest answer is I don't know. We have to go back to the data. But I do know that they don't have to be married. But they do have to have a child that's also in that place. So it's a father in that place whose kid is also in that place. They certainly don't need to be married. I'm not even sure they need to be cohabiting.
Oh, okay.
I'm not sure, but you'd have to check the data on that. So fathers seem to matter. So it could be about place, and that segues into geography. This is a piece that William Julius Wilson wrote for the blog at Organic Brookings on this kind of interesting father presence finding, where he just said this is about the broader presence of fathers in a given neighborhood. So the father thing, note that the finding relates specific to fathers, not just men in general. So it wasn't having lots of men around. That didn't help at all in and of itself. It was having lots of dads around. Seemed to help. Right. So I think this stuff gets really interesting, and where the data that they now have access to allows you to look by census tract, by race, by income, by gender, across a whole series of variables. And by the end of September, thereabouts, the Equality Opportunity Project will be distributing a online tool which allows you to look at every census tract in the US and look at the outcomes for kids from that census tract on a whole series of measures: household income, earnings, marriage rates, etc. And you can select whether you're interested in poor kids, black kids, boys, girls, etc. from each of those census tracts. So there's about to become this incredibly rich research tool. And then, as I said, I'm working in Charlotte to link that to administrative data, which then allows you to see what's happening in a particular area. So in terms of place-based policy, it's going to be huge. Ta-da! Chetty, famous map. This is rank slopes. So again, just correlating the ranks by, this is commuting zones. One of the problems is that the commuting zones are pretty big. So I don't know what it is here, but where I live in DC, it's like all of DC, all the Maryland suburbs, all the Virginia suburbs, huge. That's all one commuting zone. So you see these very different. So dark is higher correlation, so less mobility, using that correlation, and light is more mobility. So you'll see, particularly across the South, that's where at commuting zone level you're seeing much lower levels of mobility. But it gets more interesting, and it will get more interesting when you zoom in. So they've been able to do it by county level up at this point, but once the tool is available, you'll be able to kind of zoom in and you'll be able to see by census tract. And so I can tell you now, this is one measure, but on other measures, that whatever variation you're seeing across these commuting zones, you're going to see within a commuting zone. You're going to see within a city. So within Charlotte, where I have looked at the data, there are as big gaps within just the city of Charlotte in terms of mobility as there are between the Charlotte commuting zone and the Salt Lake City commuting zone, which is very high mobility. So this kind of incredible precision you can now get, like within metros, is going to be hugely important. But geography kind of clearly matters, and here he is, the man himself. The intergenerational mobility is a local problem. So I've become quite convinced that the very diversity by race, by geography, by gender, across the US, massive country, means that just those figures I showed you earlier showing US rates of mobility are, in my view, almost useless. Because the heterogeneity that's disguised by them is huge, and it's almost silly to compare intergenerational mobility in the US to, say, Denmark, which could fit into New York twice over or whatever, and is a completely different society. So we've really got to unpack it, and now, thanks to the work of the Equality Opportunities Project, we have the tools to do that. And this is another study from them which looked at what happened when you move to a higher opportunity place. So because they now know which places have higher rates of mobility than other places, they can look at what happens to a kid when the kid moves by the age of the child when the parents move. So this is just parents moving from a low mobility area to a high mobility area, and so the downward slope shows the coefficient going down. So in other words, the place they're moving to is helping them to the extent that that line's sloping. And then it kind of levels off. It's pretty linear. And so the reason that's really important and why you can use the data around of movers is because the whole debate about people and place is caught up on the fact that maybe it looks like that place has got certain characteristics that are bad for mobility, but maybe it's just that the people who live there have certain characteristics that are making it harder for them to be upwardly mobile, and they happen to live in the same place, right? By looking at people who move from place A to place B, you can begin to be a bit more confident that it's the place. Sure, things will have changed in the family, but not dramatically. And nicely, of course, you can actually see the effect on siblings within the same family moving at different ages. And it's the same. So even within the same family, if you move a kid to a high mobility area when the one kid is 7 and the other one's 15, the 7-year-old will have much better outcomes than the 15-year-old, controlling for everything else. That's true, particularly true in Baltimore. This is my cut of the work they did earlier, which is just looking at people born on 25th percentile, so just above that quintile line, and the effect on earnings. And here I just wanted to make the point about gender, which is you see these effects on place, but the kind of effect, the downward effect on your earnings compared to median earnings living up in Baltimore is pretty strong for boys in Baltimore and not statistically significant for girls. So the all number here disguises a massive gender disparity. There's something about growing up in Baltimore that seems to really, just that, we're controlling for everything else, that seems to hurt the long-term earnings of boys, but not girls. Again, I think this issue about gender is really running through and is getting stronger and stronger in this literature. So I was going to do this place-based stuff, but I think I'll move on. We can come back to it if people are particularly interested in Winnick or why we should care about Scranton, but I'll move on to the next piece now. So I now want to talk. So I've tried to sort of set out the scene of the trends and what's happening and a bit about why. And now I want to talk about the mechanisms by which inequality is perpetuated. And I'm outlining two that I distinguish between. One is market meritocracy, and there the main issue is education, and the second is opportunity hoarding. So by market meritocracy, what I'm talking about is that in a relatively free labour market, the labour market will, hopefully, if it's operating reasonably functionally, reward those who are adding skills and human capital to the endeavour. Right? They'll get a return on it. And so if you enter the labour market pretty productive with good skills and good education, you're going to be useful to your employer, etc., you're going to earn more. Right? Not always. There'll be some discrimination, etc. But as a general principle, I think that meritocratic impulse in the labour market has been quite good for equality. The idea that it should be the best person for the job, regardless of race or gender or sexual orientation or whatever, is a good idea, is a good principle. But it also means is that what you hit the labour market with, the level of human capital you hit the labour market with, becomes highly determinant of your success. So in my view, the labour market is principally where inequality is expressed rather than where it's created. I think inequality is primarily created before the labour market, in the acquisition of the skills, attributes, education, credentials that will be valued in that labour market. So in that sense, the market is quite meritocratic. Whether that's a good or a bad thing becomes a question of politics and philosophy, which I'll now dive into. So first of all, I'm going to unpack this idea of meritocracy. It is 60 years ago since this book was written, which coined the phrase meritocracy. This is written by Michael Young, as you can see, British sociologist, pretty famous sociologist. Struggled to get it published. He wrote it, first of all, just as a straightforward academic text, couldn't get it published. Rewrote it as a novel, kind of novelized version of someone who then time travels or whatever to a place that's become a meritocracy, or like a historical novel. And the narrator is called Michael Young in the book, so it's very weird. It's very kind of meta. And he describes a society that's become a meritocracy instead of the previous aristocracy that it replaced. And he defines merit in the book as IQ plus effort. So be clever and work hard. Sort of things that, you know, politicians will say all the time. You know, people who work hard, who are smart or whatever, they should be able to get ahead, right? So that idea. Now, he worried about the term meritocracy. And the reason he worried about the term meritocracy was because those of you with a classical training will know that it's taken a word with a Greek root and a word with a Latin root and put them together. And he thought no one would take him seriously if he created a word from two words, one with a Greek root and one with a Latin root. This is the kind of thing social scientists worried about in the middle of the 20th century in Britain. Don't ask me which is which one's Latin and which one's Greek, although someone's found out for me, whatever. But he got them together and said, no, I don't like that because it's one Latin, one. Right. As it turns out, that wasn't the thing he needed to worry about. The thing he needed to worry about was the fact that this book was written as a warning. It's a dystopia. His meritocracy is a dystopia. And it was written as a warning against what would happen to a society that came to believe in the meritocratic ideal. And in the book, 4 things happen. 1, inequality rises quite significantly. So I should say that what's happened in this society is there was an aristocracy, they've got rid of it, and now everything's done by IQ tests. Everyone's IQ is measured regularly, it's public record, so I could find out what your IQ is, etc. It's a bit like that movie Gattaca. Anyone's kind of seen that, where you can get a DNA test of kind of, sort of like that. 4 things happen. 1, inequality rises because the winners feel entitled to their winnings. Because after all, it's a meritocracy. And the reason I'm so rich can only be because I'm brilliant and hardworking. So no, I'm not going to give any of it to you. So there was a gradual rise in inequality. The second thing that happened was that the people who weren't doing very well in this society became increasingly angry and despairing and resentful. Because they weren't doing very well and they were constantly being told, well, it's a meritocracy. That can only be your fault. And it turns out that it's quite painful to be unsuccessful in a society that tells you it's a meritocracy because you have no one else to blame but yourself. Better in some ways to live in a society that's incredibly hierarchical, you know, just accept it. Right? There are no kids in wearing T-shirts in the UK saying future king or future queen. Okay? Here you have people saying future president. And you know what? They might be. But you don't get future queen or future king because we know who's going to be the future queen or the future. We have a hereditary monarchy, right? So it's not a secret. And so there's no chance. You know, I can't say to my kids, well, if you work hard and you do around, maybe you could be king one day. Because they can't. In some ways, so if you never become a king or an aristocrat or very rich in a society where you never had the slightest chance of being there, maybe that's, cognitively, that's easy to deal with. Than being in a society where, yes, you could be amazingly successful if only you were smarter or more hardworking. Right? The fact that you're not, so people get angry, they got angry and despair. Third thing that happened in this society is that everybody got obsessed with who they married and who they mated with. Because the key was to have smart kids, clever kids, high IQ kids. So IQs are a matter of record, and people were matching IQ to IQ because they wanted to breed. And to the extent that IQ is hereditary, they wanted to give their kids the best possible chance by having smart kids going forward. So there was a rise of what is called in sociology assortative mating. I think I mentioned that earlier, which is the tendency to marry people who are more like yourself, and that's now happening more and more in the US now. In fact, on some measures, people are somewhat more likely now to marry across race lines, some race lines, than they are to marry across class lines, as defined by education. And so that's a growing trend to kind of, a woman at Princeton got in terrible trouble by telling the Princeton undergrads, make sure you find a spouse here. If you want to be successful, there was a huge kind of social media flurry around it, but at least she was just saying it out loud. That's actually what's happening. And then the fourth thing that happens as a result of rising inequality, rising resentment, and obsession with who you marry was a bloody and violent revolution led by a populist leader which overturned the whole system as a result of the anger that had been created by the losers in the meritocracy. Tell you what, 60 years ago, it's worth a reread, this dystopia that he talked about. I've already mentioned this. So this is, yay, get these kids into these colleges and they'll do better. So why don't these colleges take more of these poor kids? And then we'll have a real meritocracy. Well, we've seen they don't. then which colleges do they go to? Well, it depends on your income. So this is, now of those who go to college, right? So I've now just taken out people who aren't going to college, and I've gone back to my 40-40-20 income group. Is what kind of post-secondary institution do they go to? A two-year institution, a community college, a non-selective public institution, a selective, or Ivy plus kind of elite. And what you can see from that is the obvious story. We kind of know this. You can see a number of charts will kind of show you is this kind of very, very significant skew. So kind of where do people, of those who go, bear in mind a lot of them don't go, but of those who go, the modal institution for bottom 40 is community college. For middle 40, it's community and non-selectives are going to be about 50%. And then selective is a pretty broad category, but basically almost very few. Whereas for those in the top 20%, this upper middle class group that I'm interested in, the modal is going to be a selective institution and hopefully an Ivy League or an elite college. That's the norm within that group. Now, yes?
Sorry, just to get some perspective, like what ranks do the selective universities fall in? If the Ivies are like the top 20s.
Yeah, so it's the Ivies plus, I can't remember. I'd have to kind of go back and break it. And back to the point about measurement, people are defining this in different ways. And I could get different results by defining selectivity differently. So Sandy Baum does it differently, Taraj Chetty does it differently. However, the overall pattern's the same. It's a good question. I don't know the answer. But now we can do it. Let's do it for some specific institutions. Someone was talking with, who was I arguing with Harvard about at the break? Someone was saying Harvard should take more poor kids. I can't remember who it was. Anyway, this does now parents' income quintile of the people at those different institutions. So we've got Harvard, we've got UC Berkeley, we've got SUNY Stony Brook, and then we've got Glendale Community College. And so you just got to get a sense of the sort of skew that you'll see. Again, this is all online. It's not kind of, none of this is kind of secret. And then this is Chetty's work again. They stuck the top 1% on there as well, just to show that you're getting huge proportions from there. David Leonhardt has written a lot about this in the Times. But we know this. Okay, so it's not just going to college. It's where do you go to college? What kinds of colleges do you go to? Where you see this kind of massive sorting, where it'd be true of Harvard. It's a bit less true of UC Berkeley, but that 2/3 of their kids are from the top 20% and more from the top 1% than from any of the other quintiles. In fact, there's more from the top 1% than, it's about the same from the top 1% as there are from the bottom 60% at Harvard. Yes?
Can we argue that this is also an expression of inequality because it depends on I'm using a British example here, but if you go to Eton or Harrow, you're going to go to Cambridge or Oxford. You're not going to go anywhere else.
Yeah. A bit less than they used to, but yeah. But because they're getting better grades, yeah. So that's when we come to the idea of meritocratic admissions processes being a huge problem. Basically, my view is that we should have a largely meritocratic labour market. We should have a somewhat anti-meritocratic education system. A meritocratic education system means that those who are already doing well and getting good test scores get more resources, get into a better institution, which then gets them into a better institution and so on. So it's just piling upon piling. Whereas it seems to me that if actually what you're trying to do is do as much as you possibly can to get people close to a similar starting line before the labour market, then you'd actually wanting to do almost exactly the opposite. You'd want more resources on the poorer kids. You'd want the best colleges for those who are struggling the most. Not for the ones who are going to do fine anyway. Instead, what happens is you just amplify it. And so the idea of meritocratic admissions is profoundly anti-egalitarian and profoundly anti-social mobility, because the people who present with the kind of merit you're measuring are disproportionately going to be those from more affluent backgrounds who've been able to accumulate it along the way, so you just end up perpetuating. So here's what the colleges will say. They might say, well, we'd love to take more poor kids, but we're meritocratic. And these are the SAT scores by income. I'm going to do it by race as kind of well. I have to use College Board. This is based on College Board data, so I have to use their income buckets. Household income across here, up to here, and they got 200 plus. And that's for kind of reading, math, and writing. Obviously, the writing has become much more controversial recently, but just kind of put them in by family. These are the average SAT scores for those who take the SAT from within those income buckets. So depending on what kind of, what SAT score, kind of combined SAT score you think you're going to need to get into one of those institutions, they can just say, well, look, it's not our fault. Let's say you're going to take the kids who've got combined SAT score of more than, whatever, choose a line, right? Just choose any line on the left-hand axis and then draw it across the chart. Now, those are averages, but still, you're going to end up with kids from affluent backgrounds because the kids from affluent backgrounds have got higher SAT scores. If you're using SAT score as your primary way of getting in. Of course, there's all kinds of weird stuff that goes on around admissions. It isn't just about this, but just purely this idea. So you could say, look, let's say it was this, pure meritocracy, we're just letting the best, that's fine. New York's selective public high schools have been doing exactly the same thing. The mayor is trying to change that in a way that is proving extremely controversial in New York. New York's selective high schools have a single test, and they just take the kids who do best on that test. So they're taking 200 kids. If you're in the top 200, you're in. It's just absolutely, completely objective, transparent, one test. There are almost no black kids at those schools anymore. I think Bronx Science and some of the others now are 2/3 Asian American. And so there's this huge battle brewing in New York about this because they're trying to instead say the best performers from each middle school should go into those high schools or other ways of doing it. Pure merit as an admissions process will have this potentially class perpetuating approach. Yes?
The issue then is not college, it's just that college is too late, right? What Dr. Heckman and Flavio Cunha says about dynamic complementarity.
What they say about what, sorry?
That if you grab the child younger, you can develop the skills for him to have a higher ACT later on. But if you do it too late,
so
the disparities are already
there. Sure. So what I just said earlier, that the labour market is where inequality is expressed. Well, here you can just say colleges are where the prior inequality is expressed. Okay? So you have to level up before the point of college admissions. Right? Then you go back again, and then you go back again. My point is simply that we have to decide that there's a collective interest in applying the pure merit principle, not that we apply it purely anyway, much later than we currently do. I do not think that admission to colleges should be meritocratic. I think that by making them meritocratic, as merit is defined, this kind of narrow version of merit, it will inevitably reproduce class inequality. And I have some proposals for how you might do that in a moment. This is not to say you just chuck merit out the door and make I'm not saying Harvard should become an open access community college, right? That everyone should go in. But I do think there's a great deal you could do to move away from a pure merit model, which I was going to talk about, which I will talk about. If I forget my proposals on this, I'll come back. So here's the challenge, the one you just identified. It has to happen earlier, so that you don't have this. If this line didn't look like this, Harvard, everybody would be thrilled to take more kids from poor backgrounds. They want to take more kids from poor backgrounds. They just haven't got the grades or the SAT scores, okay, on a meritocratic basis. So I'm going to introduce you to a philosophical principle introduced by Bernard Williams, British philosopher, sadly lost to us now, who imagined a society which he called the warrior society. I always struggle to say that correctly. Warrior? Sometimes when I say it to American audience, they think I'm saying worrier, like a society where everyone's really worried all the time. And I don't mean that. So someone say warrior in a good American accent. Warrior. Okay, good. Warrior, good. Warrior. A warrior society. So in this warrior society, I can't do it. Fighter society. In this fighter. So it's an imaginary, it's a thought experiment. You have a society where the people who get most of the money and the resources are the people who are fighters, who are kind of defending. And it's hereditary. So if you're, and just make it gendered, as I think he did in his original piece, but where that I'm doing that. So basically the sons of fighters become fighters, and they get the money, and they get to kind of, get to be rich and so on. And if you weren't born to a fighter, then no chance. Back to like a hereditary money. So it's a hereditary society in which status is you're born into. And then there's outrage at this. And there's a change because people say this is totally unfair. My son or daughter should have a chance to become a fighter and therefore get all the rewards of becoming a fighter. It's not fair. So they say, okay. So they introduce a meritocratic test of how good a fighter you are. And they don't even know what your background is. They just find out how good a fighter you are. But because the kids whose parents were fighters had more food, more nourishment, and had daily fighting training paid for by their parents, and they have also inherited, maybe there's a bit of genetic, but we don't know because they turn out to be awesome in the test. And so they become fighters. even though it's completely meritocratic test, because of the advantages that accrued to them from having parents who were previously fighters. So you end up with a hereditary meritocracy. And this is what happens. In this society, and this is Bernard Williams, I'm quoting from him now, saying, the reformers, the people who wanted to change it to this egalitarian, to this meritocratic, say, we haven't got equality of opportunity. The wealthy reply, in fact, we have got equality of opportunity, and that the poor now have the opportunity of becoming warriors. It's just bad luck their characteristics are such they do not pass the test. We are not, they might say, excluding anyone for being poor. We're excluding people for being weak. And it is unfortunate that those who are poor are also weak. So you introduce a meritocratic test, and you still see this perpetuation of status across because of their ability to, maybe a few get through, and then you herald those few as a sign of how successful you are, but basically perpetuates. Now, it's a quite difficult sort of thought experiment to think about, so let's change it. Instead of it, let's make it about college. Let's say we introduce meritocratic tests so that everyone can get into college now, regardless of race, background, etc. You get the SATs and the GPA, fine, you can get into any college. But it's not happening, as I just showed you. So the reformers protest that equality of opportunity is not being achieved. The wealthy reply, in fact, it has. And the poor now have the opportunity of getting good college educations. It's just bad luck their characteristics are such they do not pass the test. We are not, they might say, excluding them for being poor. We're excluding people for being dumb. And it is unfortunate that those who are poor are also dumb. And if that's your measure, so they are. Right, so that's how the meritocratic principle in this kind of society gets changed. And I'm going to, when shall I give my suggestions? So let's do it now, because I don't know when I'm going to go. Let's suggest, like, what would you do? Okay, so let's say I can persuade, I'm talking to some of the colleges, let's say I can persuade them that this is just a bad idea to just say, look, just take the top SAT scores, right? And do something more, do something that's better than that, right? That narrow meritocracy. First of all, let's get rid of all the other stuff they do. You know, I don't understand, Z-listing, legacies, you know, alumni, donors. Can you play that game where there's like a thing and a net that you throw the ball around with? You know, whatever. Or just get rid of all that stuff. Let's at least be able to see what's happening. But let's go further than that and say, look, I understand you want to get smart kids, you want to get the best kids. So I had this conversation with the president of an elite college quite recently. I said, okay, I know your athletes get in with lower SAT scores. They get a bump. In fact, a bigger bump than I think than legacies do. So what's the average? You know, if I'm an athlete at your college, what do I need? What SAT score do I need to get? And he said, I don't know, 1,200 or something. Right? I don't know what the numbers are, but whatever it was, as opposed to the 1,300 you need to get into. I'm not giving you real figures. 1,300 that you need if you're a non-athlete. And I said, and how do the athletes do? You know, do they have the chops? Do they have the skills? Do they have the education to do well? Oh yeah, they're fine. They do great. I said, okay. So I now know what your bottom line is. I know anybody with 1,200 or more is going to be fine. I know that because you just let in your athletes with that and your legacies with that, and they're doing fine. So it doesn't need to be 1,300, does it? So how about this? How about, all right, we're going to let in the top, we're going to let in 20% of our freshman class is going to be the best SAT scores, the people who just got perfect SAT, perfect, you know, just these whatever, these super creatures. Like you. I don't know what your SAT scores, but I'm going to assume that you all just got top SAT scores. Right? So I'll take 20% of on that kind of meritocratic system. That still leaves 80% of my places to fill. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, okay, for this, we need people to get an SAT score of at least 1,200, say, right, to flourish here. And we're well aware that's be easier for some people to achieve than others, etc. So rather than saying I'm going to take you with 1267 rather than you with 1237, which might just mean that they sneezed during the test or something, and these other weird things, I'm going to say it's 1,200. So anybody with an SAT score of more than 1,200 can get into my college. Slight problem. 50 times as many people with SAT scores of more than 1,200 apply to my college than I have spaces for. What do I do? I could go but to the existing system and say, well, I'm going to start tweaking it. I've got a better idea. Let's pull their names out of a hat. Let's make a lottery of it. Let's just say, look, there are so many people who are qualified enough to kind of come to this college. This is fantastic. We would love you all to come. Plenty of charter schools do this. We'd love you all to come. We know you've got the chops to make it. Just going to pull it out of a hat. And you, low-income kid in a suburb of San Antonio, Texas, who got more than 1,200, has got exactly the same chance of getting into my college as you, upper middle class kid from Bethesda, Maryland, has to get in. Now, the kid from Bethesda, Maryland has got a much better chance of getting that 1,200, but conditional on getting it, no better chance of getting in. It's a lottery. And the great thing about a lottery is it doesn't generate resentment among the losers. It generates disappointment, might be upsetting, I really wanted to get in, but if it's genuinely random, that's it. Everyone understands that. Why not? Right? So I'm still setting a bar, but I'm just not saying it has to be absolutely kind of people at the top. So it's not moving to a completely anti-meritocratic system, but it's adjusting the current system to massively change the competition. If that happened, you get flooded with applications from elsewhere. Once word got out that you have the same chance of getting into that college as anybody else, regardless of who your parents are, or whether they donated, or whether they're alums, or whether they can play the game with the stick thing, with the net thing, doesn't matter. Wow, why not? That's my proposal. So I've already shown you his name, but you know who this is, right? Who's this? Rawls. Yeah, Rawls. Do you know the veil of ignorance? Who's done philosophy? Someone's done philosophy, yeah. Do you know the veil of ignorance? What is it? Tell everyone. Say it loudly. So
that society justice principles cannot be made based on what people think their position is going to be on society, but on ignorance or on the probability that they might fall under any rank or any...
Right. Exactly. So socially just society is one that we create behind the veil of ignorance, not knowing what position we're going to occupy in it, what skills, what gender, whatever. So we don't know who we're going to be. Let's create a society. The problem is, if you know who you're going to be, it's difficult to do that. So here it is. No one knows his place in society, his class, nor does he know his fortune, the distribution of national assets, intelligence. So you don't know anything about yourself. Design a society, not knowing anything about yourself. That's the social contract that's formed behind this veil of ignorance, which is a famous concept in political philosophy, and a really elegant way to think about a social contract, thought experiment. But it's a little bit difficult to think about not knowing who you're going to be. So it's a hard thought experiment. You know, anything about yourself is quite hard. How would I engage in the contractual debate not knowing anything about myself? So I'm going to adjust rules, this formulation. So how about this? How about no one knows his children's place in society, their class, position, or social status, nor does he know their fortune, their intelligence and strength, etc. It's a bit more plausible for me to think about, I don't know where my kids are going to end up. I don't know how smart they're going to be or whatever. I've got a pretty good sense of where I'm going to end up. You know, things can go wrong. But I know who I am. I have no idea how my kids are going to kind of turn out. And actually, that might be quite a powerful thing to not know. So maybe you construct a social contract based on nobody knowing anything about where their kids are going to end up. What would my attitude towards food stamps be, or health insurance, if I thought my kids were as likely to need them as anybody else, say? And actually, I wrote a piece in the Times called "Stop Pretending You're Not Rich," which got some attention. And they had to shut down the comments field in the end because it provoked a certain number of comments. My email certainly filled up a bit too. Because I was basically kind of pointing at the top 20% saying, stop pretending you're not rich, you are rich, and you're a class-bound society, and you should feel bad about it, basically. And this was what, but I went through some of the comments before they shut it down, and this was kind of one from Illinois, from Oak Park, Illinois. And says this: the desperation to keep your kids in the top 20% is partly driven by the fear of what happens to people who are in the middle or lower, job insecurity, etc. So in other words, it's like my incentives to kind of make sure my kids don't fall are going to be pretty high if I look down and it doesn't look so great down there. I've already mentioned the income inequality that's growing. So there's those issues down there. And so it might be that that will have an effect. Here is just a very straightforward representation of the gap between the 90th and 50th percentile. This is actually in terms of earnings. This is individual earnings in these three countries in the 90s and the 2010s, essentially to say that it's obvious from what I've shown you before, but I'm giving you international context. It's just further to fall, right? So if you're in the middle of that top quintile and you drop to the 50th, you've fallen further in the US than you have in other countries, and it looks like that gap's growing a bit. But maybe even more important than just the income thing is housing market, access to health insurance, etc., is that many more things are bundled together with income in the US. So in other words, in the US, money matters more because many of the things that might be provided as public goods in other countries are not done so here, like healthcare, for example. I went through a period of thinking that you could understand pretty much everything about America from the movie Jerry Maguire. Does everybody know the movie, the Tom Cruise movie? It's pretty old now, really dating myself, but it's worth a watch. There's a moment in there where the Renée Zellweger character joins him as he goes off to set up this small business, and she has a kid that's got health problems, and they're in the elevator. Have you seen Jerry Maguire? I'm desperately hoping anyone's seen Jerry Maguire. Am I literally the only person that's okay? Thank you. And she gets thank God. There will come a day where I am the only person in the room. She gets into the elevator with them as they go off to set up their new business, and the first question she asks him is one that no European has ever understood, and every American instantly understood. Her first question was, will you have health insurance? The European people went, what? That's a funny question to ask. Like, because we have socialized healthcare. So you just wouldn't think to ask that. But her first, like, absolutely, will you have health insurance? So in other words, access to health, other good things tend to come with money in the US. So it's not just it's further to fall, but it might matter more. So I'm going to have a go at the Gatsby curve. I know Steve's already done this. And the Gatsby curve has been done to death and probably not entirely full story, etc. But I want to try something other than the opposite to what Steve, which is that the Gatsby curve, which is the relationship between inequality and mobility, might work the other way around. So rather than growing inequality leading to less mobility, I'm going to suggest, and I can't do any more than suggest, that it could be the other way around in the following way. Inequality widens, stakes rise for downward mobility, incentives for those at the top maintain their position, to maintain a position, increase, and if it's successful, you get lower mobility. But it could start there. It could go round, right? So the less mobility there is, the less chance of your kid falling down, the less worried you are about redistribution, etc. So you don't have more redistribution because I'm not in the Rawlsian thought experiment, and so my incentives to protect position are higher because of inequality, but my incentives to help those who are lower down may well be blunted by the fact that I am not going to be lower down, and I'm increasingly certain my kids aren't going to be either, because of the success of my strategies to hold them up. So it could be the effect of lower mobility on support for redistributive policies that end up driving inequality. I don't know, but we shouldn't assume that the causality only runs one way. Now I'm going to do a little bit of Adam Swift. I can't remember, did I put Adam Swift's paper on the reading list? Would perfect mobility be perfect? I did not, did I? Okay. I would suggest it, somebody who gets interested in it. Adam Swift wrote this paper just challenging the idea of intergenerational mobility. Yeah? And I'm not going to do all of these, but here are some of the things that he talks about, that when we think about mobility, we need to be the normative assumptions. So I've talked a lot about, be careful about the empirical assumptions that are being made. You need to think very hard about the normative and ethical assumptions that are being made along the way too. And so he says we've got to think about these various things. And I'm going to talk about the first two, but I'll mention the bottom three briefly. Free choice versus adaptive preference is that maybe someone doesn't want to go to college. If that's the case, they're going to be less successful. Do we mind? If they've got a strong preference for not doing it, we have to respect that preference, right? Was that preference adapted in some way? So if you were a woman 50 years ago, you might have said that. But that would have been partly because you were living in a very sexist society. So you have to think about how preferences are formed as well as how they're expressed. Preferences aren't just revealed. Preferences are also formed. And that's where sociology matters. Like egalitarianism, I won't do the others. I don't have time. But I'm going to do these two, odds ratios versus opportunity distribution. There's almost everything I've talked to you about so far. It's been statistical odds ratios, percentage from here, percentage to there, percentage there, percentage there. Just odds ratio. I said a couple of times, I said chances. And I tried to catch myself. Because maybe you had the chance to move, just didn't want to. And so this is the point that Swift makes, is that two societies, or the same society at different times, can manifest identical patterns of mobility between class positions, yet distribute other kinds of opportunity in very different ways. It is chances as opportunities, not chances as statistical probabilities that matter. So very common to say life chances, which I know I can put up my charts, odds ratios. I just showed you statistical probabilities. I didn't really show you anything about chances or opportunities, right? And Swift would say it's our responsibility to ensure opportunities are available, but not to mandate that everybody takes them up. So some chooses maybe not to take it up. That's quite important. And he illustrates it in the following way. So you've got a society that's here. It could be two different societies. He's done it as a society that changes over time. It's a very sort of simple way of thinking about it. This is what's happened over here. Okay, so the bottom circle is the working class, and he's just done a two-class thing to make it simple. And then the top one is the middle class, defined by, as you can see, some sort of measure of standard of living. And he's a philosopher, so he doesn't care what that is. He can just say whatever you want to make it, just something. Could be number of pebbles. But it's just a measure of standard of living in that society. And the size of the circles is how many people are in each of those classes. So we're starting off with a society where there's a whole bunch of people in the working class and pretty poor. And then some people, not as many, in the middle class who are better off by some margin. And then on the right, we have a society that has become significantly wealthier, significantly richer. So now you can see the people in the working class, however you kind of define it, are now as rich as the people were in the middle class, or just about as rich in the middle class as they were a century ago. And in the meantime, the middle class has gotten much bigger. So there's many, many more people in the middle class than in the working class. Imagine that the percentage chance of moving from the working class to the middle class is exactly the same in both societies. In other words, they have exactly the same amount of intergenerational mobility. Yeah, but you want to be in society too, right? In fact, even if there was a slightly lower chance of moving, relatively speaking, from the working class to the middle class, you might well still choose Society 2 over Society 1. In fact, you'd be somewhat irrational not to, because in Society 2, even if you aren't upwardly mobile and you're still stuck in the working class, you're still pretty well off. And look, you've got a decent chance of being in the middle class, because there's a lot more people there now. So these statistics I've shown you, these relative kind of movements, are just about statistical probability. And they miss the fact that this society on the right has way more opportunities, even if there's no more relative mobility. So in a way, I'm attacking my own work now. There's no more relative mobility, but a whole hell of a lot more opportunity to live longer, live well, have leisure, have a better life. You would choose Society 2, even if it had a bit lower mobility. Right? I could labor the point, I won't. The other one is the difference between outcomes and opportunities. So far I've shown you outcomes. College, income, earnings, etc. Just all these outcome measures, right? Because they're in the data. Easy to get at. Doesn't necessarily mean that people didn't have the opportunity to achieve that outcome and chose not to for one reason or another. So here's Swift again. The data used, here he's talking about the data like I've just used, tell us not about the distribution of opportunities as between those different origins, but the distribution of outcomes. It is true that one cannot achieve an outcome without having an opportunity to achieve that outcome, but the converse does not hold. One can perfectly well have the opportunity to achieve an outcome that one does not, in fact, achieve. And what Swift would say is, it's about the distribution of opportunities that matters, not how many people take them up. Now, as it happens, we have pretty good evidence that when people are given more opportunities, they will take them up and change the odds ratios. But it's still a hugely important point. I'll give you one empirical example of a study that I came across so long ago that I can't even find the reference anymore. I'm pretty sure I'm remembering it right. It was a study of high-achieving high school kids from Texas and their chances of going to a selective college by their race. And the comparison was between white kids and Hispanic kids. And the question was, and there's a gap. So conditional on being about the same level of ability at high school, the white kids were much more likely to go to a selective college, a highly selective college, than the Hispanic kids. But on closer examination, it turned out that you could explain all of that difference by one question in a survey, which was, how important is it to you to live close to your family when you're in college? And the Hispanic kids said yes in much bigger numbers than the white kids. And the selective colleges, the highly selective colleges, were far away. Okay, so I've got different outcomes for my high-performing Hispanic kids and high-performing white kids in terms of one outcome measure, which is attendance at a highly selective college, which may predict their earnings. But it was because of their preference to live closer to their family. So at that point, as a policymaker, you're in an interesting point, I think. because we need to respect the preferences of different people for different reasons. You might not stop there. You might wonder what lies behind that. You might worry about adaptive preferences, etc. But nonetheless, you can't just crudely assume that a gap in outcomes automatically translates to a gap in opportunities. And it may well be that some people are making life choices about themselves, their families, how they spend their career. Maybe you go to maybe you go to college and then you don't get a fantastically well-paid job because you care about doing something else, or your outcomes are bad. That college, you're dragging down the average earnings for that college. But do I care? No, because you're doing something that you're choosing to do something else. So in other words, we have to kind of respect preferences and agency, even as we kind of talk about these overall statistical patterns. Right, now it gets fun. Opportunity hoarding. So far I've tried to talk about the fact that the way that market meritocracy, mediated through education, which is meritocratic and shouldn't be, or at least not as much as I've argued, that explains, I think, the overwhelming majority of the inequality we see and the endurance of that inequality across generations. The reason why my kids, brackets my middle kid who I talked about earlier, are going to do better in life is because coming from an upper middle class background, they're going to be better prepared. Go to a good school, good skills, good environment, etc. Good right. So they're going to flourish in the labour market. God hope they flourish in the labour market. Because of their background that they've kind of had. It's not the market's fault. The market is going to take them, hopefully, and say, hey, what an incredibly skilled person. I'm going to pay you well. Right? The market's not a snob, typically. But then, and that does most of the work for us, but just in case, we just do a bit of hoarding around the edges, a little bit of cheating around the edges. So I define opportunity hoarding in the following way. First of all, I borrow the term from Charles Tilly, from his book Durable Inequality, which remains a classic of the genre. And he talks about opportunity hoarding largely across racial and ethnic lines rather than class lines, although he talks about the fact it could be used across class lines. I take the basic idea and then repurpose it for my argument. And here's how I define opportunity hoarding. Define it as you take a valuable opportunity for your future prospects, so the acquisition of certain skills or credentials or qualifications, maybe a certain social contact, a network contact or something that's going to be good for you in the future. Right? It's going to enhance your opportunity, obviously, because it needs to be opportunity. Secondly, it needs to be scarce in order to be hoarded. You can't hoard something that everyone's got plentiful amounts of, right? Generally. So you'd hoard water, but only when there was a water shortage. Okay. So something about this is what a philosopher would call a positional good, which is a positional good is a good that is valuable only to the extent that other people don't have it. The classic example is from the literature is a house with an uninterrupted view of a lake, of a pristine lake without other houses on it. Definitionally a positional good, because as soon as everybody else puts houses on the lake, you don't have it anymore. But more broadly, you could kind of think about it, this kind of arms race around education we talked about too, which is as more and more people get four-year college degrees, maybe you need a master's or a PhD to kind of basically to distinguish yourself from the majority. So you're going to see these, if everyone had a PhD, the labour market value of a PhD would be pretty low. Okay? So it's got to be scarce. And then finally, and most importantly for my argument, it has to be allocated. So I've got this scarce good, which is good for opportunity, which is allocated in an anti-competitive fashion. Right? So it's not even just a narrowly fair contest for, like, you're the best fighter, you get it, or whatever. Or you got the highest SAT score. Right? I'm not talking about that anymore. I'm saying that there are other factors entirely independent of a person's individual performance entering into the equation. So my decision to take you into the college or make you a fighter or whatever isn't just about how well your academics or your fighting ability or whatever. Something else enters into the equation. Something else that is nothing to do with you. Nothing to do with your individual capacity to do that work. That's what I call opportunity hoarding. And I think there's some of it going on in the US now. And that's where things get sticky, because that's where we get involved, and that's where very often we're intentionally supporting institutions or policies that promote inequality to our and our children's benefit and to the detriment of others. Yes?
Just had a question about the political side of it. It's upper middle class votes in much lesser numbers than in general, right? The turnout rates are much lower.
Sorry, you mean the upper middle class?
Yeah.
No, they vote more. Yeah, the top 20% vote more than everybody else. Yeah. It's a pretty linear relationship between voting and income. So yeah, the top 20% vote more than everybody else. So how they vote for it is another matter. But this is not really about who you voted for in the 2016 election. This is how you voted when as we'll get onto, when your housing board wanted to build affordable housing in your neighborhood, or when your school board wanted to do something to slightly integrate your schools. Those are the votes that really count when it comes to dream hoarding. So I'll just give 3 examples. Exclusionary zoning, legacy preferences in admissions, and opportunities for internships, which are ways in which where I think you're seeing this, as I've defined it, opportunity hoarding taking place in a way that is detrimental to inequality. So I'll take, and of these, I would say that in terms of impact, exclusionary zoning, which I'll define a bit more in a moment, is the biggest. I think the US housing market is pretty troublesome at the moment. In fact, calling it a market might be being a little bit generous. Given the thicket of zoning regulations that influence it in many ways, given the kind of number of laws that people kind of face. In fact, a free market in housing would be a pretty good thing in some ways compared to what we've got now, and then I'll go through the others. So I'm going to start with exclusionary zoning. This was from a famous article, I think, from saying that the rent is too damn high. The trend is here. This is median rent. It's true for houses are getting more expensive. As wages aren't keeping up. That's a pretty established fact. It varies significantly between places, however. So my colleague Jenny Schutz at Brookings just did a paper which I call the Goldilocks paper, which is where some places where houses are not expensive enough to generate assets that people might use, particularly for retirement. Places where it's about right, I call them the Goldilocks places, and other places where it's just too expensive for ordinary people to live there. So this is a general picture, but it does vary significantly by area. The difficulty is that the areas of greatest economic activity and opportunity tend to be the ones that have less affordable housing, for reasons we'll get into. Why? Well, this was from a Ganog and Shoag paper, which uses this quite innovative, not everyone likes it, but innovative approach to sort of measuring how much more zoning there is over time. And this is just a kind of measure of court cases which mention land use regulation over time in the US. So just literally just put all the court cases into one massive database and then set a machine off to search for mentions of land use regulation. This is the number that they came up with. It just shows massively growing land use regulation, some of which, of course, was inspired by segregation and attempts to racially segregate the US. But even after the passage of the Fair Housing Act and so on, you'll see that's really taking off. And then it becomes more about income segregation. It becomes more about the opportunity to stay in a particular place. Here's a great example from a PhD thesis, actually, by Morrow, quoted by Jason Furman in a report from the Council of Economic Advisors, which used Los Angeles as an example of this issue. So what this chart does is it shows you the black line is, this geographical area is the same, it's LA, shows you how many people could live there based on current zoning. That's what the black line is showing you. It's zoned for how many people, is what the black line shows you. The red line shows you how many actual people live in Los Angeles. So you can see it goes down. So back in the day, back in 1960, Los Angeles contained 2.5 million people, but was zoned for 10 million. So there's loads of room. The zoning would allow easily 10 million people. But as the population of Los Angeles grew to, and you can see, and then you've got a measure of the gap, to 4 million, so did the zoning come down too. So basically what's happened is that the zoning of Los Angeles has essentially shrunk to fit the population of Los Angeles over time. Now maybe they were wrong in 1960, and it couldn't possibly hold that many people. I don't think that's right. My reading of it is that Los Angeles could easily hold 10 million people, easily. But it can't anymore because of that. And most of that is local zoning, under control of local governments. Once a place gets more established, then using zoning regulations to maintain the character and the economic profile of the place that they live in. Now, then you get a perfect storm, because think about a society where school admissions are largely geographically based. And the geography is based on where your house is. And in which you give a really substantial subsidy through the mortgage interest deduction to people who want to buy expensive houses and can afford to do so. Then you've got a great way for me, I don't need to go private, I can just buy a house, expensive house, in a place that's near a great school. And the realtors know that. They'll constantly tell you, this is in the attendance zone for that great school, etc. This is in the public system. They're going to live there. We know it has a bump on price houses. It affects house prices to live in those kind of areas. So it gets expensive. Again, thank you, Uncle Sam. I get a big mortgage interest deduction. The mortgage interest deduction doesn't do anything to increase home ownership rates. All it does is increase the depth of home ownership by encouraging me to buy a more expensive house than it otherwise would have done. That's basically what it does. It's about depth, not breadth, the mortgage interest deduction. It's horrible policy, but I think we'll probably hear more about that tomorrow. So I've got this perfect situation now, which is I'm living in an expensive house in an expensive neighborhood. My kids get to go to, I'm describing my own life now, my kids get to go to a really high quality public school as a result of it. Fantastic. And I'm getting subsidized to do it by the taxpayer. Thank you. The only thing that could screw it up is if a bunch of poor people moved into the area, or even middle income people moved into the area. All right? That would really mess things up. It would change the character of the school, it would change the character. Fortunately, I have local zoning regulations to hand. I can zone them out. So exclusionary zoning is when above and beyond anything that could possibly be justified by environmental concerns or even aesthetic concerns or anything else, the zoning is just too tight, particularly around single-family dwellings, which basically crowds out everybody else. You can't afford to live in my neighborhood. Just can't afford to. And it comes up for vote, and the very same liberals who attack 529 will either not show up to the housing board meeting or they'll be there saying stuff about parking or trees or school capacity or something. Whereas what they're really saying is, oh no, really expensive house, great school. I'm being a bit unfair, but not much. I gave a talk in San Francisco about this issue, and I made the point there that actually the most liberal cities have the most restrictive zoning. There is a correlation between the liberal and how well zoned they are. And so it's in what Jerry Cohen calls the thick of daily life, this stuff is found out. There's a great piece from a guy from, I think it's Salim Firth, who was ex-Heritage. He was the last sensible person at Heritage. And he left and went somewhere else. I probably shouldn't say that. There probably is someone else sensible at Heritage. I apologize. But Stuart Butler's at Brookings, Salim Firth's gone somewhere else. Who wrote a piece, he said, and it was like the two boards that determine opportunity in America. And it was the school board and the local zoning board. Those two boards, the twin turbines of American inequality, really, at a local level. Because then you're sort of challenging people. So you use kind of zoning, you zone people out, and that has, why do I think that's hoarding? I think it's hoarding land at that point, right? There's plenty of land in a lot of these places. But because we've overzoned them, the land's too expensive for people to kind of live in, which means they don't get access to the labor markets that we get access to. And we're doing it either intentionally to protect the wealth that we have, the subsidized wealth we have in our houses, or because we want to protect the character of our local schools, or whatever. But it's intentional. We can change it if we want to. We can loosen the housing regulations in the places that we live. We don't have to go straight to massive high-rise, low income. We can just loosen it everywhere. Then it would create more capacity. Land is becoming a massive issue again in the US. The US is shrinking. It's not literally shrinking, of course, but it's shrinking in the sense that economic activity is getting more and more concentrated. So the areas of economic opportunity are more geographically concentrated than they were before. Those places are getting crowded. They're getting cramped. They're getting expensive. Starting to feel a bit like Europe. And so what people used to do in the US was move to opportunity. They'd move to the places where there are opportunities. But cross-state border moves in the US have halved in the last 15 to 20 years. Halved. And it's especially among lower skilled and middle skilled workers. And we speculate, there's lots of reasons there, but one of them has to be affordability in some of the places where they are. And so actually just thinking about, I think exclusionary zoning is a form of opportunity hoarding which denies other people the opportunity to live in neighborhoods that are close to good labor markets and good schools. It's an intentional way by which people like me keep out people who aren't like people like me in a way that is detrimental to their prospects and the prospects of their kids. And we dress it up as much as we like. It's outrageous, but we're using the housing market in that way. The housing market is rigged. It's rigged in my favor. We have to unrig it. Let's do legacy preferences and admissions, because I love this one. I'm a recovering European. I don't understand it. I get it. Everyone puts stickers on their cars, where they went to, where their kids are, and we don't do that. I mean, I know more about people's lives, their religious views, where they went to college, where the kids went to college, whatever, from being behind them in a traffic jam than I do about some of my closest friends in the UK. I mean, it's extraordinary. It's just like, they stick about where you've been. So I get it. It's tribal. It's weird. Fine. But the preponderance of allowing a hereditary principle to operate in college admissions is nonetheless somewhat startling. No other country in the world does it anymore, certainly not explicitly, and to some extent not even implicitly anymore. So it's interesting that the UK used to have legacy preferences in admissions and wiped it out in the middle of the 20th century because, as the Master of Trinity College, Cambridge said at the time, it would simply be outrageous to give people coming into Trinity a better chance of getting in just because their parents happened to go there. All you need to know is that the royal family can't get into Oxford and Cambridge. The grades aren't good enough. So they go to St Andrews, which is where William and Kate met, which has been great for St Andrews. It's now flooded with Americans who are paying top dollar to go to the college where the royals go. So fantastic for them. But Oxford and Cambridge are like, no, I mean, they would get in if they got the grades. But they don't, so sorry. That is at least purely meritocratic. But in the US, a hereditary principle does operate. And so one of the things you'll see is that your lineage or legacy gives you a tip. It helps you to get into certain institutions if your parents went there. As I said, the only country in the world that allows for that anymore. Now, how big a difference does it make? Honest answer is we don't know. Here are some data which have been culled by various places. I have the sources in my book, which just shows you straightforwardly what's the admissions rate for all admissions, and then for legacies who are applying. And you can see the numbers speak for themselves. There's big gaps. What's the problem with interpreting this chart, though? How do I know if this is actually telling me anything? I know that legacy is more likely to get in, but does that mean they're necessarily getting an unfair bump? Yeah, they might be better prepared. They might have gotten in anyway. You know, think about the children of legacies, right? If you went to Georgetown, and increasingly that means you're going to marry someone who also went to Georgetown or Stanford or some equivalent college, what do you think your kids are going to be like? And how prepared are they going to be? And then if they apply to the same place. So they might get in anyway, right? We don't know because they won't give us the data. So we can't analyze it that way. All we've got is the raw numbers. And why won't they give us the data? Well, maybe because it doesn't make as big a difference as they want people to think it does, and they want their money to keep flowing. Alumni donations peak when the alum's first child turns 16. A shocking coincidence. And so it might be in their interest for their alumni to think that it's going to help. All right? So the last thing I want to do is to find out it doesn't make much difference because they were going to get in anyway. And of course, the difference between being an alum and being a donor and so on too. Or it might be it does make quite a big difference. And those who share some of the internal data will say it does make a difference. It doesn't make as much difference as affirmative action does. The beta on it is much smaller than for that, or for athletes, but it's there. And some estimates will say it's the equivalent of about 150 points on your SAT. Say, not nothing, is it? I mean, my son would have liked it. I went to Oxford. He applied to Oxford. I'm sure he would have taken a chance. So he probably got pretty close, actually. Maybe if Oxford had legacies, maybe would have got in. Actually, because he was pretty close, so probably would have gotten in. He didn't, because he didn't get the grades. So you've got this thing happening here. I don't think it's going to be sustained. I think it's going to eventually have to go. They're locked in a collective action problem right now, but nonetheless, it just kind of strikes me as somewhat outrageous. And the thing that really surprises me about this is how again, doesn't matter about politics. In fact, sort of free market conservatives tend to side with me on this, and think, yeah, you're right, that's ridiculous. Actually, quite a lot of liberals, including the liberal presidents of many of these institutions, will talk a really good game about, well, we need that for the alumni donations, which we use to help poor people. Or it's part of creating the special magic of our freshman class. Whatever. I mean, so in my view, totally rigged. It's opportunity hoarding par excellence, because there are opportunity-enhancing goods. A place at those colleges is opportunity-enhancing. They are scarce. There are only so many slots that can be filled. And they're being rigged because you're getting in and you wouldn't otherwise have gotten in. So it's independent of your characteristics. It's something that's entirely independent. The fluke that your parents went is helping you get something you wouldn't otherwise have got, thereby displacing somebody else who would have gotten the place. That's opportunity hoarding, and yet we're doing it all the time in these institutions. And then lastly, I'll talk about internships. I'll do this briefly. Internships are becoming more important in the labour market, especially in terms of access to certain professions. It's hard to exactly know how important they're becoming. Certainly they've grown hugely in number over time. About 50% of them are unpaid. In some companies now, sort of 90%, so some of the professional services firms, up to 90% of their hires have got previous internship experience, many cases in the same place, but they've certainly got internship experience. And this is just a fairly crude survey of the roles. This is people whose job it is to recruit into organizations, and they just asked them to rank what they valued most when they're doing the recruitment and so on, and then they weighted them. It's not my study, I'm referring to somebody else's study. They're kind of weighted just to give a sense of it. I don't think it's, I wouldn't set any store by the exact numbers, but basically all it kind of shows you, and it's confirmed others, so internships are weighing increasingly heavily in the minds of recruiters, so getting an internship is important. But if they're unpaid, it's really hard to do them if you don't have some family support behind you. And that's true in Congress, it's true in certain think tanks, etc., where that's kind of built in unfairness, because it's a scarce good, it's opportunity enhancing, and by definition, you can't do it if you're unpaid. But what makes it sharper, I think, is the way they're allocated. So if internships are allocated on the basis of who you know, or on social networks, or funders, etc., given the separation that I've already shown in terms of income and residential segregation and so on, then almost by definition that's unfair. So by definition it's hoarding. So if my kid gets an internship, that's someone else doesn't get an internship. So if they got that because I made a call, I'm opportunity hoarding in a way that I think is profoundly unfair. And as internships get more important, I think that's going to get worse. Charles Murray, who is not exactly a bleeding heart socialist, describes internships as affirmative action for the rich. And I wholly agree with him about that. And he wants to completely get rid of them. In fact, I did a talk about this with David Brooks from New York Times, who met my son briefly. My son asked a question at this public event that Brooks was talking about. And my son basically said, I think parents should want the very best for their kids. You seem to just be beating up on parents, wanting to do everything they can for their kids. Isn't that a great value, great American value? I think, Dad, that you should be doing everything in your power to help me. Needless to say, he stole the show, because it's my own son saying I should be a better dream hoarder than I am. And it allowed me to sort of say that here are the things I will do and here are the things I won't do. All of us have to draw our own lines. And my line was, I'm not going to help you get an internship. I probably could use my social networks, use my professional networks to get him an internship that he wouldn't otherwise get, and which otherwise someone else would get. I'm not going to do that. So I said to him. And David Brooks leant forward and said to my son, don't worry, I'll sort you out. Come, just give me a call. Thereby undermining the whole premise of the point. But I do think that's a great example. It's become very, very controversial in the UK now. And I'll give you just show that I'm being non-partisan about this. When Michael Bloomberg was the mayor of New York, he had to get a waiver for his daughter to do an internship in City Hall, because City Hall in New York has an express policy against doing that, against nepotism in its internship allocations. But Bloomberg got his ethics commissioner to waive that policy so that his daughter could do an internship. When Bill de Blasio was elected as mayor, on a platform of reducing inequality, he appointed a new ethics commissioner. And I think the very first decision that the ethics commissioner made was to issue 2 waivers against their internship policy so that 2 kids could get an internship in City Hall, both of whom had the surname de Blasio. What surprised me about that was that there was no negative press at all, really. Everyone was just like, yeah, fair enough. Of course, if you're mayor, you're going to help your kids out. Well, what's wrong with that? It's just being a good parent. It would have ended his political career in the UK. That kind of nepotism would have ended his political career. So just these cultural differences. A lot of this is going to be about cultural norms and social norms as what's acceptable and how we react as anything else. And that's what I'm going to finish with. Before we do this, we have to solve the I'm not rich problem, which I identified in my article. So this is a breakdown of data. I'm sorry, I forgot the source of being cut off. This is Roper data that they broke for me, but it's in one of the pieces that I wrote about this, where they ask people what they think, how much money do you need to make in order to be rich? And then they break it by the income of the respondents. So the respondent income across the top here is, so dark blues are people under 30K, and these are people who are making more than 100K. And I think I can't remember if it's individual or household, I apologize. But you get the sense that the picture will be the same pretty much anyway as to what you need to pick up. And this is how much you need to be rich across there. So it's an obvious point, but it's nice to have charts for it, which is that, actually, And they just had to give a number, and then they've lumped them together. So for more than half of the people who are making under 30K, they thought rich would be something under 100K. I don't know what that is, but it's under 100K. They thought it'd make you rich. You didn't even have to get 100K to be rich if you're down there. When you go across to here, and you see the kind of people who are themselves under 100K, they think you need at least 500 to be rich. Okay? So like everything in life, it's all relative. But if we're always looking up at the people who are richer than us, and especially the people who we went to college with, and maybe even didn't get such good grades as us at college, but end up being super wealthy, that's really annoying. And in some ways, I think class warfare is alive and well in the US. It's just between the upper middle class and the upper class. That's the real anger. And in fact, to come back to the Occupy Wall Street point, on the main May Day march of Occupy Wall Street, 1 in 3 of the people marching had individual earnings of more than $100,000. Marching against inequality. See what I mean? There's a problem here that unless we can convince people there's a psychological one, who are higher up the income distribution, they're pretty high up the income distribution, they are by any definition kind of rich. But as we get more segregated and more separated, that gets harder. Everybody needs a reference point. Look, you live in New York, you live in Manhattan on 120, yeah, of course you need 500, right? Because you're comparing it. A, it's more expensive, big point. But it's also who are you comparing yourself to? So I moved to Chevy Chase, Maryland, very expensive neighborhood, very expensive house, right up there at the top of the distribution, doing fantastically well, so proud, just feeling like I'm oozing richness. I move in, people opposite, 3 German cars, beach house, apparently lots of leisure. I'm like, oh, I'm not rich. They're rich. So I'm like, God, I turn around, where's our beach house? Why are we driving this Toyota? But as our neighborhoods segregate and our institutions segregate, you can go from an upper middle class neighborhood to an upper middle class college to an upper middle class internship to an upper middle class college degree to an upper middle class, a bit of, even if you're being millennial about it, sort of a bit of Brooklyn or something, something a bit grittier for a while before moving out to the suburbs to raise upper middle class children. And so actually our reference point, so if anything, the thing that worries me most about residential segregation and educational segregation is that it's insulating upper middle class people from the actual lives of the majority of Americans. And then they get surprised by certain electoral results when it turns out there's a whole bunch of people out there who don't actually feel like they're having it so good. So inequality breeds reference point bias. And the further we get unequal, and inequality as segregation changes a reference point. As the reference point changes, we increasingly fail to see that we're rich. As we increasingly fail to see that we're rich, we'll increasingly resist attempts to make other people a bit less poor by making us maybe a tiny bit less rich than we'd otherwise be. And inequality widens further and further, and it locks in. So then we have huge problems, it seems to me, with our politics too. And this is my final point. When I was writing this book, colleagues of mine said, you have to read more Richard Hofstadter. Famous historian, great advice. I've now read a lot of Hofstadter, and he's very well worth reading again, especially his stuff on the paranoid style in American politics. That is very, very timely, I tell you, and that's pretty old. But I read this about the age of the progressive era. And his kind of read of the progressive era was it didn't come about as a result of policy virtuosity and great charts and think tanks coming up with reports. It was actually a kind of moral change. It was a cultural change that preceded it. And this is what he said. The moral indignation of the age, the progressive era, was by no means directed entirely against others. Whereas now I think the moral indignation is entirely against others. It's the rich, it's immigrants, it's people of a different colour to me, it's the poor who are feckless or whatever. It's always others. Moral indignation is always at others. It's always somebody else's fault. It wasn't great in critical measure directed inward. Contemporaries who spoke of the movement as an affair of the conscience were not mistaken. So I don't know if Hofstadter's right about that. I'm not a historian. I like his reading of it. But I do like this idea that actually preceding the progressive era and some of the institutions that took place was a bit of self-reflection on the part of those who were successful. Some inward looking, some inward criticism, and taking a little bit of responsibility, a little bit of culpability for the institutions that so many people feel they're left out of or locked out of. And I do think that something like that kind of cultural change, that moral change, is an essential first step to any of the other changes we want. Culture precedes politics, and politics precedes policy. It is no good just starting with policy. These things aren't happening in a vacuum. You have to think about the political context, and that requires us to think about the cultural context. And one of the biggest problems right now in the US is that the upper middle class, the rich, fail to see themselves as such, are too blind to how much better off they are doing than everybody else. I understand the incentives for wanting to kind of maintain your position, but it means that they are intentionally or unintentionally, we are intentionally or unintentionally locking other people out. And I think we may be reaping some of the consequences of that, because by and large, the upper middle class have managed to insulate themselves from many of the risks and anxieties that other people are facing. And that's the cultural problem, the political problem we have to face. And that does not just mean voting the right way every 4 years or putting the right signs in your yard. When your school board wants to move to somewhat more integrated schools, when the housing board wants to do something about affordable housing, when you think about how you allocate internships, or how you use your social networks to help. Jerry Cohen, one of my favorite philosophers, wrote a book with a brilliant title, If You're an Egalitarian, How Come You're So Rich? Which is a great title and a great book. He said that social justice and inequality are not just found in policies and structures and institutions and distant institutions. Social justice is also found in the thick of daily life. In the thick of daily life. And so I actually think that what's happening in our localities, in our own lives, in our own institutions, actually we should be more attendant to that. So let's not just think about inequality in this macro way, in this kind of genie way, in this kind of policy way. Let's also think about standing in our own shoes, kind of starting from where we are too, and think about how cultures of equality or inequality are generated. And maybe, hardest of all, think about our own responsibility to change some of those through our own behaviors and the use of our own power. And with that, pretty much on the nose, I'm done. But if anyone's bursting to ask a question, no. In that case, thank you very much for your attention.